Get out of this house and never come back. My mother screamed those exact words as she hurled my battered suitcase across the marble foyer. They threw me out into the freezing winter night because they thought I was a pathetic medical school dropout who could not afford to pay rent. Little did they know I had just secured a $50 million buyout for my tech company. The very next day, I would be moving into my Manhattan penthouse while they dug their own financial graves. My name is Cassidy. I am 29 years old, and this is the story of how my family traded my loyalty for a flashy con artist. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to set hard boundaries with toxic relatives who completely underestimated your worth. The explosion happened on a Thursday evening during one of my parents' mandatory family dinners in their upscale Connecticut suburb. Growing up, our sprawling brick estate was a masterpiece of careful staging. My mother Beatrice and my father Gregory cared about one thing above all else: preserving their flawless upper-crust social standing. Everything had to look perfect for the country club set. Inside the dining room, the air was thick with the smell of roasted lamb and the expensive Cabernet my father loved to flaunt. But the real centerpiece of the evening was not the food, it was Jamal Washington. Jamal, my African-American brother-in-law, was married to my older sister Felicity. At 34, Jamal was the picture of a slick, high-rolling venture capitalist. He wore a custom-tailored suit that hugged his broad shoulders, drove a sports car that cost more than most people earn in a decade, and constantly threw around complex financial buzzwords to make himself sound like the absolute smartest person in the room. My parents worshipped him. To them, he was the ultimate catch for their golden child, an ambitious financier who promised to elevate our family name even higher. Felicity, at 31, was a surgical resident at a prestigious hospital. She had always been the star of the Thorne family. She followed every rule hit, every traditional milestone, and possessed a deeply ingrained arrogance that my parents actively encouraged and praised. I was the exact opposite. 5 years ago, I realized I hated the sight of blood and the suffocating pressure of a medical path I had never actually chosen for myself. So I made the difficult choice and dropped out of medical school. In my family's eyes, that brave decision made me a complete failure, a black sheep, and a freeloading disappointment who was actively trying to ruin their perfect image. The dinner had started with the usual passive-aggressive remarks about my plain clothing choices and my supposed dead-end corporate job. I let their comments slide quietly, eating my lamb and focusing on my breathing. But then, Jamal cleared his throat loudly, flashed his trademark blinding smile, and slid a thick stack of legally binding documents across the polished mahogany table directly toward me. "Cassidy," he said smoothly, leaning back in his expensive chair, "I am closing a massive bridge round for a highly disruptive tech startup down in the city. The returns are going to be absolutely astronomical. But due to some temporary liquidity structuring, the bank needs an extra signature to clear the capital release. I need you to co-sign this investment loan tonight." I stared at the dense paperwork sitting in front of my plate. The sum was staggering. He was asking me to legally bind myself to a high-risk, completely unsecured loan. I looked at Jamal, who was drumming his fingers confidently, then at my parents, who were nodding encouragingly, as if this was a wonderful opportunity. "I cannot do that, Jamal," I said, my voice calm and completely level. "I am not co-signing a loan for a venture fund I know absolutely nothing about." The dining room went dead silent. The clinking of silverware abruptly stopped. Felicity slammed her wineglass down so hard the red liquid splashed over the rim onto the pristine white tablecloth. "Excuse me," Felicity scoffed, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. "Jamal is offering to let you be part of a major financial play and you are refusing. You should be thanking him on your hands and knees. You drop out of medical school, you work some pathetic data entry job, and now you want to insult my husband when he actually tries to throw you a bone." "It is not a bone." "Felicity," I replied, keeping my posture relaxed but refusing to break eye contact. "It is a massive liability. I am not signing my name to a debt I do not control." Jamal let out a loud, condescending laugh that echoed against the high ceiling. He shook his head, looking at my parents as if sharing an inside joke with them. Look, I completely get it, he said, adopting a patronizing, sympathetic tone. You do not have the social and financial literacy to understand elite capital markets. This is high-level stuff, Cassidy. It is not like balancing a simple checkbook. I am trying to build generational wealth for this family. You just need to sign on the dotted line. Do not let your stubborn ignorance hold us all back. Beatrice leaned forward, her face twisting with that familiar toxic disappointment she always reserved for me. Cassidy, you are being incredibly selfish right now. Jamal and Felicity are building an empire. You have done absolutely nothing with your life since you quit school. We let you come to these dinners, we include you, and the minute your family needs a tiny favor, you act like a stubborn, ungrateful child. A tiny favor, I repeated, raising my eyebrows. Mom, he is asking me to take on legal responsibility for a massive debt. If his fund is so incredibly successful, why does he need the signature of a medical school dropout who supposedly works a dead-end job? My father, Gregory, slammed his fist onto the table. The heavy thud made the crystal glasses rattle and the silverware jump. Do not use that tone with your mother, he barked, his face turning a deep, angry shade of crimson. Jamal is family. Family helps family. You have been a parasite on our reputation for 5 solid years. We have had to make endless excuses to our friends about why our youngest daughter is a complete failure. Now you have a chance to finally contribute something useful. You will sign that paper right now. I looked around the room. Jamal was smirking, radiating a false, oily confidence. Felicity looked at me like I was something foul she had scraped off the bottom of her expensive shoe. My parents were united in their absolute disdain for me. They had no idea who I really was. They did not know that while they thought I was doing low-level data entry, I had spent the last 5 years coding a revolutionary artificial intelligence platform for cybersecurity. They did not know about the sleepless nights, the grueling venture meetings, or the massive $50 million acquisition deal I had signed just 48 hours ago. They only saw what they wanted to see. A weak scapegoat they could manipulate. I slowly stood up from the table. I smoothed out my jacket and pushed the heavy stack of loan documents back across the table toward Jamal. I am not signing it, I said, my voice eerily quiet and composed. And I am officially done apologizing for the choices I make for my own life. Beatrice leaped up from her chair, her face contorted with pure, unadulterated rage. She marched over to the hall coat closet, grabbed my battered overnight bag, and hurled it forcefully across the marble foyer toward the front door. Get out of this house and never come back, she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at the exit. You are a freeloading failure. You will never amount to anything. We are entirely done with you. Gregory stood up rigidly, adjusting his tie. You heard your mother, he said coldly. You are officially disowned, Cassidy. Do not expect a single dime from us when you inevitably end up on the street. You are dead to this family. Felicity laughed softly, leaning her head against Jamal's shoulder. Let her go, Dad. She will be begging for a handout in a week. I did not shed a single tear. I did not scream back. I did not try to justify myself or explain the millions sitting in my bank account. I walked into the foyer, picked up my cheap suitcase, and buttoned my winter coat against the chill. I looked at the 4 of them standing in the warm, brightly lit dining room, completely secure in their arrogance and their delusions. Goodbye, I said simply. I opened the heavy oak door and stepped out into the freezing winter night. The bitter cold air hit my face like a physical blow, but I had never felt so entirely awake and alive. Behind me, the door slammed shut, followed instantly by the muffled sound of their cruel laughter. They thought they had just ruined my life. They thought I was walking into a dark, empty abyss with nothing to my name. They had no idea that I was walking away from their toxic cage completely free, and that the real shockwave was just about to hit them. The biting wind whipped across my face as I marched down the immaculate streets of my parents' neighborhood. I did not look back. I pulled my thin wool coat tighter around my shoulders, my cheap rolling suitcase rattling against the pavement. 2 blocks away from their property line, the streetlights vanished, leaving only the silver glow of the moon. I stopped at the designated corner. Less than a minute later, Twin LED headlights pierced the darkness. A sleek midnight black Maybach glided silently to the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the frost. The driver's side door opened. Thomas, my private security detail and newly hired chauffeur, stepped out into the freezing night. He wore a sharp black suit, completely unaffected by the cold. He gave a crisp, respectful bow, taking the battered suitcase from my freezing hand. "Congratulations on finalizing the acquisition. CEO Thorne," he said, his voice smooth and professional. "Thank you, Thomas," I replied, sliding into the cavernous heated back seat. "Take me home." The heavy door sealed shut with a satisfying vault-like click, instantly blocking out the bitter wind. I sank into the plush leather, pouring a glass of sparkling water from the built-in console. As the Maybach merged onto the interstate toward New York City, I watched the blurred headlights pass by. Every mile put physical distance between me and the suffocating cage I had just escaped. The transition had not been an overnight miracle. 5 years ago, walking away from medical school meant leaving behind the only identity my parents deemed acceptable. I remembered the cramped, unheated studio apartment I rented above a loud diner right after they first cut me off. My fingers would cramp from typing on a second-hand keyboard. The radiator constantly hissed, providing no real warmth as I wrapped myself in thick blankets, determined to prove my intellect was not a waste. I survived on cheap ramen and instant coffee, funneling every spare cent into server costs and cloud computing power. While my family paraded felicity around their country club as the ultimate success story, I was writing thousands of lines of code until my vision blurred. I was building CipherCore. It started as a side project to detect deep network intrusions utilizing a neural network that adapted to zero-day exploits faster than any human analyst could ever process. The defining moment happened during a massive stress test 3 years into development. A simulated cartel of hackers tried to breach my prototype. CipherCore did not just block them, it mapped their exact geographic coordinates and dismantled their offensive architecture in less than 4 seconds. That was the moment I knew I held a goldmine. The real payoff occurred exactly 48 hours before tonight's disastrous family dinner. I remembered sitting at the head of a glass table in a high-rise boardroom in Silicon Valley. Across from me sat the executives of a global tech conglomerate. They tried to lowball me at first, throwing out technical jargon meant to confuse me, assuming a solo female founder acting as her own lead negotiator would fold under their corporate pressure. I did not blink. I simply closed my laptop, gathered my files, and stood up to leave the room. The lead executive visibly panicked, realizing I was perfectly willing to walk away and take my groundbreaking algorithm to their biggest competitor. They shoved the revised contract across the table. I signed the paperwork transferring complete ownership of the CipherCore platform in exchange for $50 million in pure cash. No toxic venture capitalists telling me what to do. No greedy board members taking a slice of the pie. The funds hit my offshore accounts before I boarded my private flight back to the East Coast. Jamal Washington and his fake, overly leveraged startup pitches could not comprehend the kind of liquid power I now controlled. The Maybach crossed the bridge into Manhattan, the skyline glittering like crushed diamonds. We pulled up to an ultra-luxury high-rise in Tribeca. Thomas handed off my pitiful rolling suitcase to the concierge, who nodded at me with utmost reverence. I stepped into my private biometric access elevator. The scanner read my iris, and the doors silently closed, rocketing me up to the top tier of the building. The doors chimed and slid open directly into my new sanctuary. My $50 million penthouse was breathtaking. The space featured floor-to-ceiling glass windows, offering an unobstructed panoramic view of the city that never sleeps. Sleek hardwood floors contrasted perfectly with the stark white walls. Custom modernist furniture filled the sprawling living area. A massive marble fireplace anchored the room, surrounded by dramatic abstract art pieces. It was a fortress of absolute wealth, completely insulated from the petty judgments and financial anxieties that plagued my family back in Connecticut. I walked past the chef's kitchen and pushed through the double doors into the master suite. Beyond the king-sized bed lay a walk-in closet the size of my parents' entire living room. Brilliant track lighting illuminated rows of empty custom shelving and smooth marble countertops. I grabbed my battered suitcase from where the staff had placed it. I unzipped the frayed fabric, the zipper catching slightly on the worn tracks, and began pulling out the handful of cheap, pill-covered sweaters and scuffed flat shoes I had owned during my building phase. I placed them gently on the cool marble island. Tomorrow, a personal stylist would arrive to fill this massive room with custom-tailored suits, high-end silks, and designer footwear. But tonight, this cheap pile of fabric was a trophy, a reminder of the grueling grind that got me here. I walked over to the window looking down at the glittering grid of traffic far below. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket. The screen lit up with 3 new text messages. Felicity had sent a laughing emoji. My mother had texted a harsh reminder that I was dead to them. My father had sent a warning not to ask them for a loan when I inevitably went bankrupt. I did not type a response. I did not engage in their pathetic psychological warfare. I tapped on my mother's contact profile and hit block. I selected my father's number and hit block. I found Felicity's contact and hit block. Then for good measure I blocked Jamal's number too. I tossed the phone onto the plush duvet of my new bed, stripping off my cheap blazer. I poured myself a glass of vintage champagne from the Master Suite's wet bar and walked back to the glass. The toxic chains of my past were officially severed. I was 29 years old, holding $50 million and completely untouchable. My new life had just begun. 1 week later, the morning sun reflected brilliantly off the polished glass of my corner office on the 68th floor. My new workspace was a sprawling masterpiece of modern architecture right in the beating heart of Manhattan. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying view of the city grid below. Instead of a cramped cubicle, I now operated out of a massive room equipped with smart glass walls that frosted over with a single vocal command. The air smelled of rich espresso and expensive leather. I stood at the head of a long marble conference table, projecting absolute authority. I was currently commanding a team of 12 top-tier developers. These were industry heavyweights I had personally poached from major tech giants by instantly doubling their salaries. They respected me not because of my last name, but because they had seen the raw source code I wrote for CipherCore. We were launching a brand new software incubator, a holding company designed to fund and develop aggressive cybersecurity protocols. My lead engineer, a brilliant coder named Marcus, was presenting a complex data architecture on the massive digital display. I pointed to a specific string of code highlighting a minor latency vulnerability and instructed him to patch it before deployment. He nodded respectfully and immediately began typing. There was no condescension in this room. There were no arrogant brothers-in-law talking down to me. There was only pure execution and mutual respect. I was entirely in my element. Suddenly, my smartwatch vibrated against my wrist. A restricted number was attempting to bypass the heavy firewall on my private communication line. I frowned, stepping away from the conference table. I tapped my earpiece to answer, assuming it was a Swiss banking liaison, finalizing the last minor details of my $50 million cash transfer. Instead, a shrill and sharply familiar voice pierced my ear. It was Beatrice. My mother had somehow circumvented the hard block I placed on her personal cell phone by using an unknown restricted landline. Cassidy. I am only going to say this once, Beatrice snapped. Her tone was dripping with that same unearned toxic authority she always used to keep me in line. Your father and I have discussed your little tantrum, and we have decided to offer you a very generous path to redemption. I remained perfectly silent, staring out the window at the sprawling concrete jungle of New York. Beatrice took my silence as complete submission. She genuinely believed I was sitting in a miserable, freezing apartment somewhere crying over being kicked out of her pristine suburban mansion. Felicity is still completely furious with you? Of course, my mother continued, her voice echoing with pure delusion. But we are willing to let you back into the family fold. However, you will need to show genuine remorse for insulting Jamal. Our annual country club membership dues are pending this week. You will wire $5,000 to my account by noon today as an apology tribute. Consider it a fine for your terrible behavior. Do this, and we will allow you to attend Sunday dinner. Fail to send the money, and you will remain permanently cut off from this family." I let out a soft, dry laugh. The audacity was truly staggering. She thought $5,000 was a sum that would break me. She thought financial extortion would force me to crawl back to her perfectly manicured feet. She was demanding an apology tribute while I was literally wearing a custom diamond watch worth 10 times that amount. "You have exactly zero leverage here, Beatrice," I said, deliberately dropping the title of mother. "Your delusion is actually quite sad. Do not ever call this number again." Before she could utter a single shocked gasp, I tapped my earpiece and severed the connection. I immediately walked over to my private terminal and contacted my head of corporate security. I instructed him to initiate a permanent network block on all inbound communications originating from any Connecticut area code. I told him I wanted zero exceptions. If anyone from my past tried to reach me, they would hit an impenetrable digital wall. The final frayed string connecting me to that toxic suburban illusion was officially cut. I felt a massive rush of dopamine. Money bought many things, but the greatest luxury it provided was the absolute power to enforce impenetrable boundaries. I returned to the conference table just as the main display screen flashed a brilliant emerald green. The final compilation was successful. My team of developers erupted into cheers and applause. We had just hit our first major software milestone a full 2 weeks ahead of schedule. The new architecture was completely flawless. "Incredible work, everyone," I announced, projecting my voice over their celebration. "You delivered exactly what you promised. We are celebrating today. Take the rest of the afternoon off." As the team excitedly packed up their gear, I stepped back to my desk and accessed my exclusive concierge interface. When you possess $50 million in liquid capital, the impossible doors of New York City fly wide open for you. I wanted to reward myself, so I decided to book a private lunch at Le Coucou. It was a notoriously exclusive Michelin-starred establishment known for its severe privacy policies and heavily guarded entrances. Billionaires and celebrities routinely waited months just to secure a table in the main dining area. I bypassed the waitlist entirely, paying a staggering cash premium to secure their highly coveted private VIP dining room for a solo lunch. I wanted to sit in absolute quiet and enjoy the taste of my own hard-earned victory. I grabbed my designer coat and took the private elevator down to the subterranean parking garage. Thomas was already waiting by the open door of the black Maybach, the engine purring softly. I gave him the destination, leaning back into the heated leather seats as we pulled out into the bustling Manhattan traffic. I watched the city blur past my tinted window, feeling like a conqueror stepping into a new kingdom. I was heading to one of the most secure and heavily guarded restaurants in the world to celebrate my absolute freedom. I had absolutely no idea that the universe had a very different plan for my quiet afternoon, and that my meticulously planned celebration was about to collide violently with a ghost from my past. The Maybach glided to a seamless halt on the cobblestone streets of Soho. Thomas immediately stepped out, opening my door before the valet could even reach the curb. I stepped onto the pavement, the brisk wind barely registering against my new bespoke silk suit. Before me stood the imposing, unmarked entrance of Le Coucou, a fortress of high society dining where power and wealth were served alongside Michelin-starred cuisine. I walked through the heavy brass doors into a world of soaring ceilings, whitewashed brick, and spectacular glowing chandeliers. The maitre d' spotted me instantly. He completely bypassed a line of furious socialites and minor celebrities, bowing his head with deep deference. "Right this way to your private dining suite, Miss Thorne." I followed him past the crowded main floor and into a secluded, soundproofed room at the back of the establishment. I had intended to eat completely alone to savor my victory, but word of my $50 million acquisition had already sent shockwaves through the financial district. Two managing partners from a Titan Wall Street firm had literally begged for 10 minutes of my time, offering to pay for my entire lunch just to pitch their wealth management portfolios. I allowed them to join me, taking a seat at the head of the long oak table. They treated me like absolute royalty, hanging on my every word, desperate to secure a fraction of the cipher core fortune. Halfway through the meal, the heavy atmosphere of corporate groveling became suffocating. I needed a moment to breathe. I politely excused myself, stepping out of the private suite and walking into the dimly lit, velvet-draped lounge area near the restrooms. The lounge was meant for quiet, intimate conversations, heavily shadowed and isolated from the main dining room. As I walked past a row of high-backed leather booths, a frantic, highly strained whisper cut through the low jazz music playing overhead. "I just need until Friday. I swear the capital is coming." I stopped dead in my tracks. The voice was pitched dangerously high, completely stripped of its usual slick, arrogant baritone. But I knew that voice. It was the same voice that had mocked me at my parents' dining table just 1 week ago. I stepped closer to the decorative brass partition, shielding the corner booth. Peering through the geometric metalwork, I found him. Jamal Washington. He was not closing a multi-million-dollar venture capital deal. He was not holding court with elite investors. He was physically trapped in the corner of the leather booth, boxed in by two massive, dangerous-looking men. They wore cheap, ill-fitting suits that starkly contrasted with the elegance of Le Coucou. Their knuckles were scarred, their necks thick with muscle. They were underground enforcers, loan sharks. The entire illusion of Jamal's billionaire status disintegrated right before my eyes. The custom-tailored suit he wore was heavily wrinkled, dark sweat stains, bleeding through the expensive fabric under his arms. His hands were trembling violently as he gripped a cloth napkin, desperately wiping perspiration from his forehead. "Please," Jamal begged, his voice cracking with pure terror. The bridge loan fell through. My stupid sister-in-law refused to co-sign the liability forms. I could not get the bank to release the funds. But I have another mark lined up. I just need 72 hours. One of the enforcers leaned forward. He did not yell. He did not cause a scene. He simply reached across the table, his massive hand shooting out to grab Jamal by the silk lapels of his suit. He yanked Jamal forward so hard that a crystal water glass shattered against the edge of the table. "Your time ran out yesterday, Washington," the enforcer growled, his voice a low, gravelly threat. "We do not care about your bank. We do not care about your family. You borrowed $2 million from people who do not forgive debts. We want the principal plus the vigorish by midnight tonight. No more extensions, no more fake business pitches. If the money is not wired by midnight, we are going to start taking pieces of you." Jamal let out a pathetic, suffocated gasp. He was completely trapped. The confident, high-rolling venture capitalist my parents worshipped was a complete fraud. He was nothing but a desperate con artist, drowning in illegal debt, scamming his way through high society, and trying to use my signature to save his own life. Desperate for any way out, Jamal turned his head, his panicked eyes darting wildly around the dimly lit lounge, looking for a waiter or a security guard to intervene. Instead, his sweeping gaze locked directly onto the brass partition. He locked eyes with me. For a split second, utter confusion washed over his sweating, terrified face. He blinked rapidly, clearly believing his absolute panic was causing him to hallucinate. He expected to see a broke, pathetic medical school dropout. He expected to see the weak girl he had successfully exiled into the freezing night. That was not what he saw. At that exact moment, the two Wall Street managing partners stepped out of the private suite behind me. They flanked my sides immediately, their posture practically subservient. Miss Thorne, the senior partner, said, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet lounge. "If we could just finalize those wealth management term sheets before you leave, we would be incredibly honored to handle your estate." Jamal heard the reverence in the banker's voice. His wide, terrified eyes drifted down from my face to my wrist. The ambient lounge lighting caught the edge of my sleeve, illuminating the custom diamond Richard Mille watch strapped to my arm. It was a timepiece worth more than the bounty hanging over his head. I watched the exact moment his brain connected the pieces. He must have read the financial blogs. He must have seen the headlines about the anonymous female founder who sold a cybersecurity platform for $50 million in pure cash. He realized the broken dropout he had thrown away was now a titan of industry. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, ashen gray. His jaw went slack. He was cornered by actual killers, and the only person in the entire city with the liquid capital to save his life was standing 10 feet away. He opened his mouth, a desperate, silent plea forming on his trembling lips. He wanted to beg me for help. He wanted to play the family card. I did not gasp. I did not show an ounce of shock or pity. I looked at the man who had manipulated my parents and destroyed my family dynamic. I slowly and deliberately curved my lips into a freezing, calculated smile. I held his terrified gaze for 3 agonizing seconds, letting the absolute weight of his impending destruction crush the air out of his lungs. Then I simply turned on the heel of my designer shoe, completely ignoring his existence, and walked back into my private dining suite with the Wall Street Titans trailing eagerly behind me. 2 days passed in a state of absolute, uninterrupted productivity. I spent my mornings analyzing new software architectures and my afternoons coordinating with my wealth management team from the comfort of my Tribeca penthouse. I assumed my silent departure from Lukuku had been the final nail in the coffin for my family's delusions. I knew Jamal must have sprinted back to Connecticut in a blind panic, terrified by the loan sharks and completely rattled by the diamond watch on my wrist. I knew he had alerted my parents, spilling the truth about my sudden, massive wealth to save his own skin. I just did not expect them to be desperate enough to orchestrate a physical ambush. The disruption began precisely at 2 in the afternoon. I was reviewing a quarterly projection on my tablet when my private intercom buzzed. It was the building's head concierge, his normally composed voice laced with severe panic. He informed me that 3 individuals had forcefully bypassed the exterior security checkpoint by tailgating a returning resident through the private garage entrance. They were currently causing a massive scene in the grand marble lobby, screaming my name and demanding immediate access to the penthouse elevator bank. I did not need to ask who it was. I calmly set my tablet down, signaled for Thomas, and stepped into my private elevator. The descent took less than 30 seconds, but the shouting echoed through the polished steel doors before they even opened. As the elevator chimed and the doors slid apart, I stepped out into the cavernous white marble lobby. The sight before me was pathetic. My older sister, Felicity, was aggressively jabbing her manicured finger into the chest of a highly trained security guard, demanding he step aside. My father, Gregory, stood near the front desk, red in the face, barking orders at the terrified concierge about his supposed legal rights as a parent. My mother, Beatrice, was pacing the marble floor, clutching her designer handbag like a weapon. They looked entirely out of place in the sleek, ultra-modern space, their suburban entitlement clashing violently with the quiet, guarded wealth of the building. The moment my designer heels clicked against the marble, the shouting abruptly ceased. All 3 of them turned to look at me. I stood flanked by Thomas and 2 other building security officers. I wore a tailored charcoal blazer and trousers that cost more than my parents' entire monthly mortgage. I watched as their eyes quickly scanned my outfit, the flawless tailoring, the subtle glow of the diamond watch on my wrist, and the imposing security details standing at my absolute command. The reality of my $50 million buyout finally settled into their minds. What happened next was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Beatrice instantly dropped her aggressive posture. Her tense shoulders relaxed, her face softened, and tears miraculously welled up in her eyes. In a fraction of a second, she completely code-switched from a screaming intruder into a weeping, loving mother. She took a step toward me, holding her hands out as if reaching for a lost child. "Cassidy, my sweet girl," Beatrice cried out, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "We are so incredibly proud of you." I stood perfectly still, letting her theatrical performance echo off the marble walls. She took another step, wiping a single perfectly timed tear from her cheek. "We always knew you were a genius," she continued, projecting her voice so the security guards could hear what a devoted mother she was. "We knew you were building something extraordinary. That night at the dinner table, we were just playing a part. We pushed you out so you could fly. We gave you the tough love you needed to finally spread your wings and embrace your true potential. It broke our hearts to be so strict, but look at you now. You did it, and we are here to celebrate your triumph." The sheer level of gaslighting was breathtaking. Just a week ago, she had hurled my luggage across a foyer and screamed that I was a freeloading failure. Now she was attempting to claim direct credit for my $50 million tech empire, spinning her toxic abuse as some kind of brilliant motivational parenting strategy. I did not flinch. I did not blink. I just stared at her, letting the cold silence stretch until her outstretched arms awkwardly dropped to her sides. Felicity stepped up next to our mother, attempting to display a supportive sisterly smile that looked more like a painful grimace. "We are family," Cassidy Felicity said, though her eyes were frantically darting around, calculating the immense value of the real estate surrounding us. "You have proven your point. You won. Now it is time to bring the family back together." Gregory cleared his throat, stepping forward to assert his patriarchal authority. He adjusted his tie, trying to regain the commanding presence he had wielded so effortlessly in his Connecticut dining room. He puffed out his chest, attempting to look like the reasonable patriarch resolving a minor dispute. "Your mother is right," Gregory said, his voice carrying a brittle, forced confidence. "We are immensely proud. And because we are family, we need to discuss a practical arrangement. Jamal has hit a slight roadblock. His venture fund is experiencing some temporary liquidity issues. It is just a minor banking delay, a brief cash flow restriction while he finalizes a massive international merger." I almost laughed out loud. Temporary liquidity issues. It was a fascinating euphemism for owing $2 million to violent loan sharks who were actively threatening to dismantle Jamal piece by piece. Because of this temporary banking error, Gregory continued completely blind to the fact that I knew the exact truth Jamal and Felicity need to restructure their living situation for a brief period. "And your mother and I have decided to support them. We need you to grant us full access to your penthouse. We are going to move in with you for a few weeks until Jamal's capital is released. It is a massive space, and you certainly owe us that much after the foundation we provided you." He did not ask. He demanded. He genuinely expected me to hand over the keys to my $50 million sanctuary so they could hide from the violent criminals Jamal had defrauded. He expected me to shield the very people who had gleefully thrown me out into the freezing cold. I looked at Gregory, then at Beatrice, and finally at Felicity. I let them stand there in the grand lobby, fully exposed in their desperate, pathetic entitlement. "You are not moving into my penthouse," I said, my voice echoing clearly across the quiet marble room. "You are not stepping foot in my elevator. You are not getting a single dime, a single favor, or a single second of my hospitality." Gregory's face darkened, the supportive father act instantly slipping. "Now listen here, Cassidy," he barked, taking an aggressive step forward. Thomas immediately stepped between us, placing a solid, immovable hand on Gregory's chest. My father stopped dead, realizing he was entirely outmatched. "I told you a week ago that I was done," I said, looking directly into my mother's shocked, tear-stained face. "I do not care about Jamal's fake liquidity issues. I do not care about your fabricated tough love. You made your choices when you threw me out. I flatly deny you entry into my life." I turned to the head concierge, who was watching the exchange with wide eyes. "These people are trespassing," I instructed clearly. "Remove them from the premises immediately. If they resist, call the police." I did not wait to hear their screams of outrage. I simply turned around, stepped back into my private elevator, and left them stranded in the lobby to face the absolute ruin they had brought upon themselves. The polished steel doors of my private elevator began to slide shut, silencing the frantic apologies of my mother. Just as the gap narrowed to a sliver, a violent roar echoed across the grand marble lobby. "You ungrateful little brat!" Gregory bellowed, his voice cracking with raw, unhinged fury. I raised my hand, triggering the motion sensor. The heavy elevator doors immediately retracted, sliding smoothly open. I stepped back out into the lobby. The loving, supportive father act had completely evaporated. Gregory's face was a dangerous shade of crimson, the veins in his neck bulging against his stiff collar. He shoved past Beatrice, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger directly at my face. He had realized the emotional manipulation was failing, so he immediately defaulted to the only other weapon he possessed: intimidation. "If you think you can just walk away with $50 million and leave us to rot, you have another thing coming," Gregory shouted, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You owe us! We paid for your entire existence. We paid hundreds of thousands of dollars for your elite undergraduate degree. We paid for your medical school tuition before you selfishly dropped out and threw it all away. I am going to sue you for full reimbursement. I will drag you through civil court. I will freeze your assets. I will garnish every cent of that buyout to repay the massive financial burden you placed on this family. Felicity nodded vigorously behind him, her arms crossed. You owe us for wasting our money, Cassidy, she sneered. You cannot just take the money and run. I stood perfectly still, letting his pathetic legal threats hang in the cold air of the lobby. I did not summon my security detail. I did not raise my voice. I simply smiled, a razor-sharp curve of the lips that made Gregory instantly falter. He expected me to cower. He expected me to panic at the threat of litigation. I reached into the interior breast pocket of my bespoke charcoal blazer. I withdrew a crisp, neatly folded document printed on heavy, watermarked legal paper. I held it casually in my hand, tapping the edge against my palm. You want to talk about lawyers, Gregory? I asked, my voice deadly quiet, but carrying crystal clear across the room. You want to talk about financial reimbursement. That is a fascinating strategy. I took 3 slow, deliberate steps toward him. He instinctively took a half step back. When I finalized the sale of Cipher Core, I did not just buy a penthouse and a nice watch. I explained, keeping my eyes locked on his. I hired the most ruthless team of forensic accountants in Manhattan. I instructed them to conduct a comprehensive audit of my entire financial history dating back to the day I was born. I wanted a pristine record of my assets to prepare for my new tax bracket. I unfolded the heavy document. The silence in the lobby was absolute. Beatrice had stopped crying. Her hands were clutching her designer handbag so tightly her knuckles were white. It turns out my accountants found something incredibly interesting. I continued smoothing the crease of the paper. They found an account that was supposed to be transferred to me on my 18th birthday. A private, irrevocable trust fund established by my late grandfather, left exclusively and entirely in my name. All the color vanished from Gregory's face. He looked as though he had just been struck by a physical blow. Beatrice let out a strangled, suffocated gasp, bringing a trembling hand to her mouth. For years you held my education over my head, I said, my voice dripping with absolute contempt. You told me I was a financial burden. You told me you were sacrificing your own hard-earned money to send me to medical school. You used that fake debt to control my every move, to dictate my major, to force me into a career I despised. But you did not pay a single dime of your own money, did you? Gregory opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was completely paralyzed. The tuition money came directly from my grandfather's trust, I stated, reading from the forensic report. You deliberately hid the existence of the fund from me. You forged my signature on the disbursement authorizations, acting as my primary trustees long after I became a legal adult. You stole my own money, paid my tuition with it, and then demanded I worship you for your generous sacrifice. That is a lie, Felicity shrieked, though her voice wavered with uncertainty. Mom and Dad paid for everything. I turned my gaze to my older sister. Oh, Felicity, you should probably stay out of this. Because the medical school tuition only accounted for 20% of the missing funds. I flipped to the second page of the audit. I looked directly at Beatrice, whose eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated terror. There was nearly $2 million in that trust, I announced, projecting my voice so every security guard in the lobby could hear the full extent of their crimes. I dropped out of medical school 5 years ago. So where did the rest of the money go? I looked down at the highlighted line items on the forensic ledger. $50,000 to a luxury floral importer, I read aloud. $120,000 to a bespoke bridal boutique in Paris. $80,000 for private jet charters to the Amalfi Coast. $300,000 for a custom catering and ice sculpture package. Felicity staggered back, bumping into the marble concierge desk. She looked at her parents in absolute horror. That is right, I said, folding the document and sliding it back into my blazer. You embezzled my inheritance to pay for Felicity's outrageously lavish wedding to Jamal. You stole from your youngest daughter to fund a high society spectacle for your golden child. You financed your country club prestige with money that legally belonged to me. Gregory was shaking. He looked frantically at the exits, realizing the trap he had blindly walked into. Beatrice was weeping again, but this time the tears were genuine. They were the tears of a woman who knew her entire life was over. "You threatened to sue me for reimbursement," I said, taking one final step toward my father. "You do not need to bother filing the paperwork. My legal team already submitted a massive civil suit for the misappropriation of trust funds in federal court this morning. Furthermore, the district attorney's office has received a copy of this forensic audit. They are currently reviewing the forged authorizations for criminal wire fraud and felony embezzlement." I looked at the three of them standing pathetic and broken in the lobby of my fortress. "I am not going to give you a single dime of my tech fortune," I whispered, my tone absolute ice. "But I am going to take back every single cent you stole from me, plus interest. And when Jamal's loan sharks find out you are facing federal asset freezes, they are not going to be very forgiving about those temporary liquidity issues." I gave a sharp, decisive nod to Thomas. My security detail moved in perfect synchronization. The guard stepped menacingly close to Gregory, grabbing him firmly by the shoulder of his suit. Two other officers flanked Beatrice and Felicity. "Escort them off the property," I ordered. My parents did not fight back. They did not scream. They were completely devoid of arrogant entitlement, reduced to silent, trembling shells, as the security team physically marched them out the revolving glass doors and shoved them onto the cold Manhattan pavement. I watched them stumble on the sidewalk through the heavy glass. The ghost of my past was finally dead and buried. I turned around, stepped back into my private elevator, and ascended to the top of the world. The heavy glass revolving doors had barely begun to spin when Felicity violently wrenched her arm free from the security officer's grasp. While Beatrice and Gregory were being successfully corralled out onto the freezing Manhattan pavement, my sister dug her designer heels into the polished marble floor. She refused to be discarded. Her face was a mask of pure, contorted rage, completely devoid of the polished country club elegance she usually projected. She lunged back toward my private elevator bank, screaming at the top of her lungs. "You are not walking away from us!" Felicity shrieked, her voice cracking and echoing wildly across the high ceilings of the lobby. "Cypher Corps belongs to this family. We housed you. We fed you. We funded your pathetic existence when you were nothing. I will drag you into federal court. I will hire a fleet of litigators to claim my rightful family equity in your little startup. You owe me half of that buyout. I am entitled to my equity." The sheer delusion was almost fascinating to witness. She genuinely believed that existing in the same bloodline automatically granted her a 50% stake in an algorithmic neural network she could not even begin to comprehend. She thought corporate law functioned like a childhood temper tantrum. The security guards immediately moved in to restrain her, their heavy boots thudding against the stone. But before they could secure her arms again, Jamal stepped forward. He raised his hands in a placating defensive gesture, playing the role of the rational, embarrassed husband. Okay, take it easy," Jamal said aloud, loudly enough for the approaching guards to hear. He grabbed Felicity by the shoulders, pulling her firmly against his chest. "We are leaving. My wife is just highly emotional. There is no need for force. We are going right now." He played the peacemaker perfectly, buying himself exactly 3 seconds of unmonitored access. As the guards paused, giving him a brief margin of space to control his wife, Jamal took one swift step forward. He breached my personal space, leaning his head down until his mouth was inches from my ear. The stench of his stale sweat and heavy cologne was overpowering. His public mask of submission instantly vanished, replaced by the desperate, cornered aggression of a man who knew his life was ticking down to a violent end. "You think you hold all the cards?" Jamal whispered, his voice a rapid, venomous hiss that only I could hear. "You think you can just watch me burn? You are going to wire me $10 million by midnight tonight. Not a penny less. You are going to do it, or I will personally ensure your entire pristine tech empire turns to ash by tomorrow morning. I know all about your new software incubator. I know you are gearing up for a massive IPO. If that money is not in my offshore routing account by 12 o'clock, I am going to every major tech journalist in Silicon Valley. I will leak a beautifully fabricated, highly detailed story, proving that you stole the core architecture for CipherCore from a rival developer. He pressed closer, his breathing ragged and frantic against my cheek. I will produce fake emails. Jamal continued, his whisper growing more manic. I will hire witnesses. I will tie you up in intellectual property litigation so severe that the SEC will freeze your new holding company before it even opens its doors. I will completely destroy your IPO. I will ruin your reputation in this industry forever. $10 million by midnight, Cassidy. You pay the toll or I burn your entire kingdom to the ground. He pulled back slightly, locking his bloodshot, terrified eyes onto mine. He was trying to project absolute dominance, but his pupils were dilated with pure, unadulterated fear. He was a drowning man trying to pull me under with him. He expected me to panic. He expected the threat of a corporate scandal to shatter my composure. He was betting his actual life on the assumption that a fabricated public relations crisis would force me to open my vault. I did not flinch. My heart rate did not elevate by a single beat. I looked at his shaking hands, his ruined suit, and the desperate, hollow threat hanging in the air between us. I slowly raised my left hand. I did not reach for my phone or signal for my security team. I simply tapped the smooth, illuminated face of my smartwatch twice. The digital display blinked, confirming a silent command. I let my hand drop back to my side. I looked Jamal dead in the eye. There was no anger in my gaze, only the cold clinical assessment of a parasite that had just been permanently eradicated. Your time is up, I said. My voice was flat, carrying no emotion, completely devoid of any familial attachment. It was a simple statement of absolute fact. I pivoted gracefully on my heel, turning my back on him without a second thought. I stepped straight onto the biometric scanner of my private elevator. The sensors registered my presence instantly. Behind me, the lobby security team finally closed the gap, gripping Jamal and Felicity by their arms and physically hauling them backward toward the revolving doors. I heard Jamal let out a strangled, pathetic sound of defeat as the reality of my rejection hit him. I did not watch them leave. I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead as the heavy, soundproof steel doors of my elevator silently slid shut. The chaotic noise of my sister's screaming and Jamal's frantic struggling was instantly severed, leaving me in absolute perfect silence. The elevator engaged, rocketing me upward, leaving them completely stranded on the cold street below to face the midnight deadline alone. The elevator engaged, rocketing me upward, leaving them completely stranded on the cold street below to face the midnight deadline alone. The absolute silence of the ascent was a stark contrast to the pathetic screaming I had just left behind in the marble lobby. The digital display chimed softly as I reached the top floor. I stepped out into my sanctuary, the city glittering below like a conquered territory. I poured myself a single glass of sparkling water, checked my encrypted email server one last time to ensure my incubator launch schedule was untouched, and went to sleep with the absolute certainty that the garbage had finally taken itself out. But cockroaches always find a way to survive the exterminator. The sun had barely broken over the East River the next morning when my private tablet chirped with a blaring priority alert. It was 6 a.m. I tapped the glass screen and opened a secure message from my lead corporate counsel, a viciously effective litigator named Harrison Vance. Attached was a 70-page legal filing. The Thorne family had not retreated to their Connecticut suburb to lick their wounds. Driven by Jamal's desperate midnight deadline with the underground loan sharks and my mother's bottomless delusion, they had chosen the nuclear option. They had filed a massive, highly publicized civil lawsuit in the Southern District of New York. The claim was utterly laughable, yet dangerous in its sheer audacity. They were officially alleging that the source code for CipherCore was built using proprietary hardware and intellectual property belonging to the Thorne family estate. Gregory was legally arguing that because I had developed the early beta versions of the algorithm while temporarily residing under his roof 5 years ago, using electricity and a desk, he provided the entire $50 million platform legally belonged to him. It was a desperate, grasping legal fiction, but they had orchestrated the rollout with surprising precision. By 8 a.m, my phone was ringing incessantly. Beatrice had funneled her high society country club connections to land a massive hit piece in the Silicon Valley. Insider, the most widely read and influential financial blog in the global tech sector. The article was a masterpiece of total character assassination. It featured a professionally lit, deeply tragic-looking photograph of my parents sitting on their pristine velvet couch, looking utterly heartbroken and betrayed. The bold headline spanned the top of the homepage: Tech prodigy steals family legacy for $50 million payout. The article painted me as a cold, calculating sociopathic daughter who had leached off her loving parents' wealth, stolen their highly guarded trade secrets, and ruthlessly cut them out of the profits. They spun a tragic narrative of an ungrateful, greedy child leaving her devoted family in financial ruin just as they were preparing for retirement. It was entirely fabricated, a complete inversion of reality, but the court of public opinion moves significantly faster than the court of law. The real damage hit exactly at 9:30 in the morning. Harrison called me, his usually calm and measured voice tight with intense frustration. Based on the highly publicized nature of the lawsuit and Gregory's incredibly aggressive emergency injunction filings, a sympathetic and easily manipulated federal judge had granted a temporary restraining order. A significant portion of my liquid assets from the CipherCore buyout was frozen for exactly 48 hours, pending an emergency evidentiary hearing. They had successfully locked up the precise amount of capital I needed to finalize the commercial leases for my new cybersecurity incubator. Jamal was actively trying to choke my cash flow, gambling that I would panic and settle. He was hoping I would pay his loan sharks just to release the freeze and keep my new company from stalling. He was using the federal legal system to extort his own survival money. I did not scream. I did not throw my tablet across the room. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of my penthouse looking out over the gridlocked morning traffic far below, and I felt a profound, chilling sense of calm wash over me. I turned away from the window and activated my communications unit. I instructed Harrison to assemble the entire legal defense team and bring them to my residence immediately. Within an hour, my sprawling, minimalist living room had been transformed into a corporate war room. 5 of the most ruthless, highly paid litigators in Manhattan sat around my custom marble kitchen island. Secure tablets, yellow legal pads, and holographic data displays covered the counter. Harrison was pacing the length of the hardwood floor, rapidly outlining a defensive strategy to quash the injunction. He was talking about filing immediate defamation countersuits, preparing press releases to counter the blog post, and bracing for a prolonged, messy legal battle that could take months to resolve. I raised my right hand. The room fell instantly silent. The high-powered attorneys looked at me, expecting to see a panicked 29-year-old solo founder, terrified of losing her newly acquired fortune. They expected to see a young woman crumbling under the weight of a vicious family smear campaign. Instead, they saw a predator. I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was a cold, calculated baring of teeth that made Harrison physically stop pacing. They wanted a war, I said quietly, leaning forward over the cool marble counter and looking at each lawyer in turn. They wanted to use the media to paint me as a sociopath. They wanted to leverage a desperate extortion plot into a family legacy dispute to steal my money. I pulled the forensic accounting dossier from my blazer pocket, the exact same document I had used to crush my parents in the lobby the day before. I slapped it down onto the center of the marble island. The sharp smack echoed in the quiet penthouse. "We are not going to play defense, Harrison," I commanded, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "We are not going to spend months tied up in civil court arguing over who bought the laptop I coded on 5 years ago. We are not issuing a polite press release. They wanted a war, but I am going to give them an execution." My lawyers stared at me in stunned silence. Harrison opened his mouth to argue the legal ethics of my statement, but before a single syllable could leave his throat, a sharp, dissonant chime echoed across the marble island. It was my secure secondary phone, a device I kept strictly for unmonitored external communications. I picked up the sleek black device. A single, heavily encrypted text message glowed on the screen, routed through an anonymous relay server. "Your assets are frozen," The walls are closing in. 10 million to the attached routing number by midnight, or the press gets the source code story. The clock is ticking, Cassidy. Jamal was feeling incredibly emboldened. He actually believed the temporary restraining order was a fatal blow to my operations. He thought that hiding behind a dark web proxy and an anonymous sender identification made him a digital ghost. He was relying on the assumption that the sudden financial pressure of a frozen account would force me to capitulate to his blackmail. He forgot exactly who he was threatening. He forgot the exact nature of the technology I had spent the last 5 years building from the ground up. I tossed the phone back onto the marble island. "Take a break, gentlemen." I instructed my legal team, gesturing toward the expansive living area overlooking the Manhattan skyline. "Get some coffee. Review the federal criminal statutes for extortion, wire fraud, and corporate espionage. I need 20 minutes alone." Harrison hesitated, sensing the dangerous shift in my demeanor, but he knew better than to question a direct order. He quickly ushered the litigators away from the kitchen. I walked past the dining space and entered my private study. This was the true nerve center of my entire existence. A massive curved glass desk sat in the center of the room, supporting a custom-built liquid-cooled terminal that powered the raw, unthrottled beta version of the Cipher Core architecture. I bypassed the standard biometric locks and initiated the core sequence. 3 curved monitors flared to life instantly, casting an icy blue glow across my face. Jamal thought he was dealing with a standard corporate executive. He did not comprehend that Cipher Core was an apex predator designed specifically to hunt, analyze, and dismantle hostile network architecture. It was a proprietary artificial intelligence built to recognize patterns in digital camouflage and rip them apart line by line. I typed a series of rapid commands isolating the routing metadata from Jamal's encrypted text message. I fed the raw string of data directly into the neural network. "Find him," I muttered to the empty room. The screens erupted into a cascading waterfall of code. I watched with clinical satisfaction as my software went to work. Jamal had attempted to mask his location using a series of cheap, commercially available virtual private networks. He was bouncing his signal through a server in Estonia, then routing it through a secondary proxy in Brazil, and finally bouncing it off a dark web node in Eastern Europe. To a standard cybersecurity firm, or a local police department, it might have taken days to unravel that digital knot. Cipher Core sliced through his amateur defenses in exactly 47 seconds. The artificial intelligence mapped his digital breadcrumbs, bypassing the fake IP addresses and locking directly onto the unique hardware signature of his personal laptop. He was sitting on the local Wi-Fi network inside the guest house of my parents' Connecticut estate. I did not just find his geographical location, I found his open network ports. His personal firewall was an absolute joke. I initiated a forceful remote breach. The progress bar on my center monitor filled instantly. I was no longer just looking at his location. I was standing directly inside his hard drive. What I found was a dark web of lies so extensive it practically took my breath away. I bypassed his password-protected folders and opened his primary financial directory. Jamal had pitched himself to my family as a visionary venture capitalist, a master of high-stakes mergers and acquisitions. The reality displayed on my screen was nothing short of a catastrophic financial bloodbath. I opened a subfolder labeled Cayman Holdings. It was a massive labyrinth of offshore shell accounts, each one cross-collateralized and dangerously over-leveraged. He was not just borrowing money from underground loan sharks. He was actively running a systemic multi-million-dollar fraud operation. I scrolled through dozens of heavily altered profit and loss statements. He had been artificially inflating his portfolio's value to secure millions in funding from private equity investors. He was then using those new investments to pay off the staggering interest on his previous failing ventures. It was a textbook Ponzi scheme, and it was currently collapsing under its own massive weight. The digital footprint laid bare the absolute desperation of his $10 million extortion attempt. The violent creditors he owed were not just threatening his physical safety, they were threatening to dismantle his entire fake empire and hand the paper trail over to the federal authorities. He was 48 hours away from total insolvency and a guaranteed federal prison sentence. I continued digging my fingers flying across the keyboard with lethal precision. I found the emails he intended to use against me to ruin my IPO. They were clumsy fabrications, doctored exchanges between me and a non-existent software developer, heavily edited to make it look like I had purchased the CipherCore algorithm on the black market. It was a pathetic, easily disprovable smear, but it would have been enough to spook my institutional investors and delay my launch just long enough to cause severe structural damage. He had weaponized my family's greed to create a highly publicized smokescreen for his own impending ruin. I did not just take screenshots. I initiated a massive silent data transfer. I commanded CipherCore to download every single byte of data on his hard drive. Every forged document, every offshore routing number, every desperate email to his creditors, every single piece of digital evidence proving his extortion, his wire fraud, and his systematic financial deception. The download completed, sealing his fate in a heavily encrypted file on my local server. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, the blue light of the monitors reflecting in my eyes. Jamal wanted $10 million. He wanted to play the role of the ruthless, untouchable blackmailer. He had no idea that he had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to eradicate him from my life and my family's life forever. I tapped the intercom button on my desk, broadcasting my voice into the living room where my legal team was waiting. "Harrison," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of mercy. "Get back in here. The defense strategy is officially canceled. We are going on the offensive." Harrison stepped back through the heavy glass doors of my study, his sharp eyes instantly darting from my face to the glowing monitors. He took in the rapidly scrolling lines of code and the decrypted financial ledgers now dominating the screens. I did not waste time explaining the technical mechanics of how I had just completely bypassed the encrypted firewall of my brother-in-law. I simply pointed to the center monitor. I told him to look at the offshore routing numbers. He leaned in, adjusting his tailored suit, his professional skepticism quickly evaporating as he read the data. But as the final decrypted archives from Jamal's hard drive finished compiling a new directory populated on my secondary screen, it was a hidden triple encrypted folder buried beneath the Cayman shell companies. I ran my proprietary decryptor slicing through the amateur security protocols in seconds. What opened before us was not just evidence of a failing Ponzi scheme or a desperate man dodging violent loan sharks. It was the ultimate twist, the actual root of Jamal's catastrophic financial implosion. He had not lost his venture capital money in the volatile tech market. He had never actually invested the capital to begin with. He had funneled the initial seed money directly to his creditors, but when that well ran dry, he needed a massive, untraceable influx of cash. I opened a subfolder labeled Medical Real Estate. I clicked on a scanned PDF and pulled it onto the main display. It was a commercial property deed. Harrison let out a sharp, incredulous breath. It was the deed to Felicity's private surgical clinic in Connecticut. My sister had spent the last decade building a highly lucrative, elite plastic surgery practice. It was her pride and joy, the sole source of her country club status, and the foundation of her arrogant superiority. But the document on the screen was a commercial mortgage agreement. Jamal had secretly forged Felicity's signature on a series of heavily leveraged corporate loans. He had used her medical license, her business tax identification, and her pristine credit rating to borrow against the clinic. He had mortgaged the entire building, the expensive medical equipment, and the practice itself to the absolute legal limit. The principal balance was staggering. Felicity was completely oblivious, but her beloved clinic was effectively owned by predatory lenders. One missed payment, which Jamal was entirely incapable of making, and the bank would seize the property, locking the doors and stripping my sister of her medical practice overnight. Harrison asked the obvious question: where did the cash go? If it did not go to the offshore accounts or the venture fund, where did he hide it? I ran a tracing algorithm on the wire transfers originating from the fraudulent clinic mortgage. The money did not go to the loan sharks. It did not go to the Cayman Islands. It went straight down the East Coast. The routing numbers led directly to a series of property and banking records in Atlanta, Georgia. I opened the final set of files. They were real estate closing documents for a sprawling 6-bedroom mansion in the Buckhead neighborhood. The property was purchased entirely in cash. But Jamal's name was not on the deed. The property was registered to a woman named Chloe Sterling. I accessed the linked banking records. Jamal had been wiring a massive monthly allowance to Chloe's personal accounts for the past 3 years. He was paying for luxury cars, designer clothes, and premium health care. Then I found the birth certificate. It was a high-resolution scan saved in a subfolder marked Insurance. The mother was listed as Chloe Sterling. The father was officially registered as Jamal Thorne. The child was 2 years old. He had a secret second family. While my parents were emptying my grandfather's trust fund to pay for his lavish Connecticut wedding, and while Felicity was parading around thinking she was married to a high-society venture capitalist, Jamal was funding an entirely separate existence in Atlanta. He had mortgaged my sister's life's work, risked federal prison, and defrauded dangerous criminals just to maintain his double life. I stared at the glowing screen. The sheer magnitude of his deception was breathtaking. He had threatened to destroy my initial public offering over a fake intellectual property dispute. He had demanded $10 million to cover up a mess that was entirely of his own making. He had underestimated me so profoundly that he handed me the keys to his own execution. I did not feel anger. I felt a cold, pristine sense of absolute focus. I initiated a mass print command. The heavy commercial-grade laser printer in the corner of my study hummed to life. For the next 20 minutes, the machine churned out every single damning piece of evidence. Page after page of undeniable ruins spilled into the output tray. Harrison stood silently watching the physical manifestation of Jamal's destruction pile up. He was a veteran corporate lawyer, a man accustomed to vicious boardroom brawls, but even he recognized the sheer lethal finality of what we were looking at. I walked over to the supply cabinet and retrieved a stack of premium heavy stock legal folders. I took the freshly printed documents and began sorting them with methodical precision. I placed the forged commercial mortgage agreements and the clinic's impending foreclosure notices into a bright red folder. I placed the offshore routing numbers, the Ponzi scheme ledgers, and the loan shark correspondence into a stark black folder. Finally, I took the Atlanta real estate deed, the wire transfer receipts, and the crisp copy of the 2-year-old's birth certificate and placed them into a pristine white folder. I aligned the 3 folders perfectly on the center of my glass desk. They were neat, colorful, and lethal. Every lie, every theft, and every betrayal was now weaponized and ready for deployment. The trap was fully set. I looked at Harrison, who was staring at the folders with a mix of professional awe and genuine apprehension. He knew exactly what was about to happen. The mandatory court mediation session was scheduled for 2 o'clock the following afternoon. It was a required procedural step to attempt to settle the frozen assets before the federal judge would agree to hear the emergency injunction in open court. We convened in a windowless conference room on the 14th floor of the Southern District Courthouse. The environment was aggressively sterile. Harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights illuminated the space, casting a sickly pallor over the beige walls and the gray industrial carpet. The room was utterly devoid of warmth, serving as a stark clinical contrast to the fiery, deeply personal tension radiating from the people inside it. A massive, polished mahogany table dominated the center of the room, acting as a physical border between 2 warring nations. They arrived precisely on time, moving as a synchronized, victorious unit. Beatrice, Gregory, Felicity, and Jamal swept into the room, exuding an overwhelming aura of unearned triumph. They took their seats on the opposite side of the mahogany divide, arranging their expensive leather portfolios and designer handbags with deliberate, performative arrogance. They genuinely believed the temporary freeze on my liquid capital was a lethal strike. They looked at me as if I were already a defeated adversary, a rebellious child who had finally been brought to heel by the superior might of the Thorne family legacy. I sat completely alone on my side of the table. Harrison and my defense team were waiting in the corridor outside. I had explicitly instructed them not to enter. This was not going to be a legal negotiation, and I did not need corporate counsel to witness what was about to happen. The court-appointed mediator, a tired-looking man with wire-rimmed glasses and a rumpled gray suit, read the standard opening disclosures. He droned on about finding common ground, avoiding prolonged litigation, and seeking a mutually beneficial resolution. My family barely paid attention to him. Their eyes were fixed entirely on me, waiting for me to crack under the pressure. Gregory took the lead, leaning forward and placing his hands flat on the mahogany surface. He adopted a tone of paternal magnanimity, attempting to sound like a reasonable patriarch offering salvation to a wayward daughter. He spoke about the unfortunate necessity of the lawsuit, claiming it brought him no joy to take such drastic measures against his own flesh and blood. He insisted that the intellectual property behind CipherCore was developed under his roof, making it a family asset. He painted a picture of a fractured family that could only be healed through a fair and equitable distribution of the buyout funds. Beatrice chimed in seamlessly, weaponizing her social connections to tighten the screws. She casually mentioned the devastating hit piece in the Silicon Valley Insider, noting how rapidly the narrative was spreading through my professional network. She offered a thinly veiled threat, disguised as maternal concern. She suggested that if this dispute proceeded to open court, the media scrutiny would completely destroy my reputation in the global tech sector. She promised that if we reached an agreement today, she would personally ensure her contacts at the blog published a retraction framing the entire incident as a simple, easily resolved family misunderstanding. Then Jamal spoke, delivering the final fatal pitch. He framed their extortion as a generous settlement offer. He stated that the Thorne family was willing to drop the entire intellectual property lawsuit, lift the asset freeze immediately, and sign ironclad non-disclosure agreements. In exchange, I simply had to authorize a wire transfer of $15 million to a designated family trust. $15 million. It was $5 million more than his midnight text message demand. He was padding the extortion to make it look like a legitimate family settlement, ensuring his loan sharks got paid while leaving plenty of excess capital for him to siphon off later to fund his secret life. Throughout the entire presentation, Jamal's performance as the deeply devoted protective husband was nothing short of a theatrical masterpiece. He sat close to Felicity, his shoulder pressing protectively against hers. He kept his left hand firmly wrapped around hers, resting on top of the table for everyone to see. He continuously shot her small, reassuring glances, acting as the steadfast anchor in her time of family crisis. Felicity practically glowed under his attention. She looked at Jamal with absolute uncritical adoration, entirely convinced that her brilliant venture capitalist husband was bravely defending her family's honor and securing their financial future. She leaned into him, totally blind to the reality that the man holding her hand had mortgaged her surgical clinic to the brink of foreclosure to fund a mistress and a toddler in Atlanta. I did not interrupt them. I did not raise my voice, and I did not offer a single word of defense. I sat perfectly still in my ergonomic chair, my posture immaculate. I unscrewed the cap of my sparkling water and took a slow, deliberate sip. The cold liquid slid down my throat as I observed them with the detached clinical fascination of a biologist studying a particularly aggressive strain of bacteria. My absolute silence unnerved the mediator, who kept glancing at me, waiting for a rebuttal that never came. But my family misinterpreted the quiet. They saw my silence as surrender. They assumed the financial pressure of the frozen assets and the public humiliation of the media smear had finally broken my spirit. I let them talk. I let their arrogance inflate to its absolute maximum capacity. I listened as they detailed the mechanics of their extortion, framing it in polite legal terminology. Gregory's demands became more forceful. Beatrice's subtle threats became more pronounced. Jamal's smug, self-satisfied smile deepened, his eyes locking onto mine with a silent, taunting challenge. They filled the sterile room with their greed, laying out their demands, and painting themselves as the reasonable victims willing to offer me a path out of my own destruction. They thought they had backed me into an inescapable corner. They had absolutely no idea that the three color-coded folders waiting inside my leather briefcase were about to obliterate their entire reality. When Gregory finally concluded his pompous monologue laying out the $15 million extortion demand, with a sickeningly sweet smile, the conference room fell into a heavy, expectant quiet. The mediator shifted uncomfortably in his rumpled suit, clearing his throat to formally ask for my counteroffer. I did not give him one. I did not utter a single syllable of negotiation or defense. I simply reached down to the floor, snapped the brass latches of my leather briefcase, and pulled out the three folders I had meticulously prepared. I placed them on the cool mahogany table. I slid the stark black folder directly across the polished wood. It stopped exactly an inch from Gregory's folded hands. He looked down at the dark cover, his brow furrowing in irritation. He expected a typed plea for mercy, a list of grievances, or perhaps a lower financial counterproposal. He certainly did not expect my absolute silence. "Open it," I commanded. My voice was a low glacial register that demanded immediate compliance. Gregory scoffed softly, exchanging a highly amused, knowing glance with Beatrice. He clearly thought I was attempting some pathetic last-minute bluff. He reached out and flipped open the heavy black cover with exaggerated casualness. The smug patrician arrogance vanished from his face with the violent speed of a physical blow. Inside was a fully drafted, comprehensive federal indictment. I had instructed Harrison to prepare the document under the strict, uncompromising guidelines of the United States Department of Justice. The primary page detailed the exact federal statutes for wire fraud, embezzlement, and grand larceny regarding the total liquidation of my grandfather's trust fund. Gregory's eyes darted frantically across the paragraphs, absorbing the irrefutable, completely damning evidence. I had included the verified bank routing numbers, the forged withdrawal slips, and the precise forensic accounting trail showing exactly how he had funneled the stolen capital into his failing business accounts to artificially inflate his net worth. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His chest hitched sharply. He literally stopped breathing, his lungs paralyzed by the sudden, suffocating realization that he was looking at a guaranteed 20-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. Beatrice whispered his name, alarmed by his sudden pallor, but Gregory was completely immobilized, staring into the abyss of his own ruin. I did not wait for my father to recover his breath. I picked up the bright red folder and sent it sliding down the center of the table. It came to a sudden rest directly in front of Felicity. She blinked her perfectly manicured hands, hesitating over the cardboard cover. She looked toward Jamal for guidance, but Jamal was currently staring at Gregory's trembling hands with a growing sense of profound alarm. Felicity cautiously opened the red folder. The top document was a final, aggressively worded notice of foreclosure from a ruthless commercial lending institution. Felicity stared at the numbers, her brow creasing in deep, profound confusion. The legal notice clearly stated that her elite plastic surgery clinic, the absolute crown jewel of her high society standing, and the foundation of her immense pride, was in terminal default on a massive, highly leveraged corporate mortgage. She rapidly flipped to the second page, then the third, her breathing quickening into shallow, panicked gasps. She was looking directly at the forged loan applications, the astronomical principal balance, and the unpayable predatory interest rates that Jamal had secretly saddled her with. She saw her own forged signature guaranteeing the massive debt. The pristine, untouchable life she thought she had built was a fragile, hollow shell, entirely owned by underground creditors. She looked at the total amount due, a figure so catastrophically high it defied basic comprehension. Her eyes darted wildly across the text, absolutely unable to compute the magnitude of the betrayal. She tried to speak, to ask a question, to demand an explanation from the husband sitting right next to her, but her vocal cords completely failed. She just sat there, her mouth slightly open, staring at the undeniable financial death warrant of her medical career. 2 targets systematically eradicated in under 60 seconds. The sterile mediation room was suddenly devoid of oxygen. The court-appointed mediator sat frozen in his chair, completely paralyzed by the violent, terrifying shift in the power dynamic. He recognized an execution when he saw one. I kept the third pristine white folder firmly pinned under my right hand. I did not slide it across the mahogany table. I did not open the cover to reveal the Atlanta real estate deed, the wire transfers for the secret Buckhead mansion, or the crisp copy of the 2-year-old child's birth certificate. I did not need to show the documents to achieve the desired effect. I simply rested my palm flat against the white cardboard and locked my eyes directly onto Jamal. He was no longer playing the role of the devoted, protective husband. He was staring at the red folder in Felicity's shaking hands, recognizing the commercial mortgage documents he thought he had hidden deep within his encrypted hard drive. The terrifying realization was slowly blossoming in his mind. If I possessed the heavily guarded financial records of his clinic fraud, then I had successfully breached his secure server. And if I had breached his server, I had access to absolutely everything. I looked directly into his eyes, maintaining a cold, unblinking stare. The absolute silence in the room was deafening. I lifted my index finger and tapped the top of the white folder twice. The sharp, distinct sound of my fingernail hitting the cardboard echoed like a gunshot. Jamal's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror. The color vanished from his face as his gaze dropped to the folder pinned under my hand. He knew exactly what it contained. He knew that the secret second family, the mistress, the child, and the massive diversion of stolen funds were all sitting right there, waiting to be unleashed. He stopped breathing, his heart rate visibly spiking against the collar of his expensive dress shirt. He was completely trapped, stripped of his leverage, and staring at the total annihilation of his entire existence. I watched the absolute dread consume him, and I did not blink. The absolute dread consumed him, and I did not blink. The silence stretched so tightly across the room, it felt like a physical wire ready to snap. Jamal stared at my hand resting on the pristine white folder. He understood the lethal geometry of the trap. He knew I had the Cayman ledgers in the black folder and the Connecticut Clinic foreclosure in the red folder. By simple deduction, he knew exactly what the remaining white folder contained. He knew I held the birth certificate of a 2-year-old child in Atlanta and the property deed to a mansion bought with stolen money for his secret mistress. I was offering him an unspoken ultimatum. Drop the lawsuit, or I open the white folder right here in front of the wife whose life he had just financially obliterated. Jamal broke. The polished high society venture capitalist facade shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He stood up so violently that his heavy leather chair tipped backward and crashed onto the gray industrial carpet. The sharp thud echoed off the beige walls. Sweat beaded instantly on his forehead, catching the harsh fluorescent light. He did not look at me. He spun toward Gregory, his hands trembling as he planted them on the mahogany table. "We need to walk away right now," Jamal choked out, his voice cracking with raw, unfiltered panic. "We drop the suit. We drop the injunction. We walk away today." Gregory stared at his son-in-law as if the younger man had just lost his mind. Gregory's own face was still a sickly shade of gray from reading his federal wire fraud indictment in the black folder, but his arrogant greed was fighting a desperate battle against his fear. "What are you talking about?" Gregory demanded, his voice a harsh, strained whisper. "We are not dropping anything. She is cornered. We demand the 15 million. We have nothing." Jamal shouted, his panic completely overriding any sense of decorum or strategy. He waved his arms frantically, pointing at the folders without actually looking at them. "You do not understand what she has. She has everything. If we push this into open court, we all go to federal prison. We drop the lawsuit immediately." Beatrice recoiled in her chair, clutching her designer handbag against her chest. She looked from her husband's terrified face to Jamal's sweating, erratic movements. She could not comprehend how her master plan was dissolving into total chaos. She turned her sharp gaze to me, but I remained perfectly still, my hand resting gently on the white folder, waiting for the chain reaction to reach its final stage. It reached Felicity. My sister had not heard a single word of Jamal's frantic pleading. She was completely deaf to the shouting match erupting on her side of the mahogany divide. Her eyes were locked onto the final notice of default inside the red folder. Her brain, highly trained for complex surgical procedures, was finally processing the brutal, uncompromising mathematics of her own destruction. She traced the lines of the forged commercial mortgage. She read the staggering principal balance. She read the predatory interest rates. She realized the elite surgical clinic she had built with a decade of grueling work was gone. It belonged to underground creditors, and she was personally liable for millions in fraudulent debt. Felicity slowly lifted her head. The unquestioning adoration she usually reserved for her husband was entirely gone. Her perfectly contoured face was a mask of pure absolute horror. Jamal, Felicity said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm, barely a whisper, yet it cut through the shouting match like a scalpel. Jamal froze. He turned to look at his wife, his eyes darting frantically to the red folder in her hands. He tried to construct a lie, tried to deploy the usual charming deflection that had kept his double life afloat for years. But the sheer weight of the evidence crushed the words in his throat. "What did you do?" Felicity asked, her voice rising in pitch, the initial shock rapidly metabolizing into something feral and dangerous. "You forged my signature. You mortgaged my clinic. You stole millions of dollars in my name." "Where is the money, Jamal? Where is the venture capital fund?" "Felicity, please," Jamal stammered, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "I can explain everything. It was a bridge loan, just a temporary liquidity issue. I was going to pay it back." "You bankrupt parasite," Felicity screamed. The elegant, composed country club doctor vanished entirely. Felicity lunged across her chair violently, hurling the red folder directly at Jamal's chest. The heavy paper struck him, scattering the foreclosure notices and forged mortgage documents across the polished mahogany table and onto the industrial carpet. She did not stop there. She grabbed him by the lapels of his expensive suit, her manicured nails digging into the fabric, shaking him with a sudden violent strength born of total devastation. "You ruined me!" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the sterile walls of the mediation room. "You stole my life! I will kill you! I will absolutely kill you!" The perfect family image physically disintegrated before my eyes. The facade of wealth, unity, and superior breeding completely collapsed into a shouting, violent brawl. Jamal stumbled backward, trying to peel his furious wife off his suit. Gregory was shouting at both of them, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson as the reality of his own impending federal indictment collided with the destruction of his daughter's life. Beatrice panicked. Her entire existence was predicated on maintaining the illusion of aristocratic perfection. She realized the court-appointed mediator was sitting at the head of the table, his eyes wide with absolute shock, watching the Thorne family tear each other to shreds like rabid animals. "Stop it," Beatrice hissed, lunging forward to grab Felicity's arm. "Not in front of the mediator. Have some dignity. Stop this right now." Felicity violently shoved her mother away. "Do not touch me," she screamed, turning her wrath toward Beatrice. "You brought him into this family. You told me he was a billionaire. He is a fraud. We are all frauds." The room descended into total anarchy. Jamal was frantically trying to back away toward the door, realizing that his physical safety was now severely compromised. Gregory was yelling at Beatrice, blaming her for the entire catastrophe. Felicity was sobbing and screaming, picking up a heavy crystal water glass and hurling it at the wall. The glass shattered into 1,000 pieces, raining down over the expensive leather portfolios they had arranged so arrogantly just 20 minutes prior. I did not intervene. I did not offer a single word of commentary. I simply watched the fire burn. I turned my attention to the mediator. The rumpled man was pressing himself firmly into the back of his chair, looking completely traumatized by the viciousness of the implosion. I caught his eye and offered a small, polite nod. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the standardized federal withdrawal of claims form. It was the legal document required to formally dissolve the temporary restraining order and release my frozen assets. I slid the document across the table toward him. He did not hesitate. He practically snatched the paper, eager to facilitate the end of this nightmare. He signed his name on the designated line, officially terminating the mediation and lifting the injunction against my accounts. He slid the authorized form back to me. I uncapped my fountain pen and signed my name with fluid, graceful strokes. The asset freeze was dead. My capital was secure. The Cipher Core incubator launch would proceed exactly on schedule. I neatly packed my pen, the signed federal release form, and the 3 color-coded folders back into my leather briefcase. I snapped the brass latches shut. The sharp click was entirely drowned out by the sound of Felicity screaming at Jamal about a fraudulent offshore wire transfer. I stood up, smoothed the front of my blazer, and pushed my chair back into place. I did not look at my parents. I did not look at my sister. I did not look at the man who had tried to extort me. I turned my back on the screaming, the shattered glass, and the absolute ruin of the Thorne family legacy. I walked across the gray industrial carpet, opened the heavy glass door, and stepped out into the quiet corridor, leaving them to burn in the inferno they had built for themselves. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom suite clicked shut behind me, instantly muffling the shrill echoes of Felicity's rage. Harrison was waiting by the elevator bank at the end of the long corridor. He took one look at my face, registered the unmarked federal release document in my hand, and simply nodded. We rode the elevator down in absolute comfortable silence. The descent felt like a physical shedding of dead weight. When the ground floor doors parted, I walked straight through the cavernous marble lobby of the Southern District Courthouse and pushed through the revolving glass doors. The sudden blast of late afternoon sunlight was blinding. I stepped onto the wide, sweeping granite steps of the courthouse, inhaling a deep breath of warm, unfiltered city air. The oppressive clinical chill of the mediation room was gone. I stood at the top of the stairs, looking down at the bustling street below, feeling an overwhelming sense of crystalline clarity. My assets were secure. The extortion plot was neutralized. I had executed my defense with surgical precision, leaving absolutely no loose ends. I barely had a moment to enjoy the sunlight before the heavy glass doors behind me violently burst open. The Thorne family spilled out onto the granite landing, a chaotic, thrashing mass of shattered egos and ruined reputations. They had been forcibly ejected from the building by court security. The pristine, untouchable image they had so carefully cultivated for decades was entirely obliterated. Gregory's bespoke suit jacket was rumpled and pulled askew. Beatrice was clutching her designer handbag like a flotation device, her perfectly coiffed hair now frayed and erratic in the coastal breeze. Felicity was hyperventilating, her mascara running in dark streaks down her flushed cheeks, while Jamal hovered near the edge of the group, looking like a trapped animal, desperately scanning the street for an escape route. The argument had not stopped. It had merely been relocated to the public square. Felicity was screaming at Jamal, demanding to know how he had bypassed the clinic's internal financial controls. Jamal was rapidly backpedaling, spouting frantic, disjointed excuses about bridge loans, temporary liquidity crunches, and venture capital delays. He kept waving his hands, attempting to construct a narrative where he was the victim of market forces rather than the architect of a massive fraud. Gregory turned his fury on his son-in-law. He pointed a trembling finger directly at Jamal's chest, his voice booming across the courthouse steps. Gregory roared that he was going to hire the most vicious white-collar defense attorneys on the Eastern Seaboard to personally ensure Jamal spent the next 2 decades in a federal cell. He threatened to strip Jamal of his name, his assets, and his freedom. Gregory was desperately trying to reassert his patriarchal dominance, acting as though he still possessed the power and resources to exact retribution. He was completely ignoring the lethal reality of the black folder I had left on the mahogany table, the federal wire fraud indictment that was currently hanging over his own head. Beatrice was frantically trying to pull Gregory back, her eyes darting nervously toward the pedestrians passing by on the sidewalk below. She hissed at him to lower his voice, terrified that someone from their elite social circle might witness this vulgar display of domestic implosion. She was still clinging to the delusion that they could somehow contain the fallout and preserve the Thorne family legacy. Then, cutting through the shouting and the wailing, a cell phone began to ring. It was a sharp, persistent, incredibly mundane sound. Gregory patted down his suit pockets, his face flushed with rage, and yanked the ringing phone from his breast pocket. He glanced at the screen, his furious expression faltering for a fraction of a second. He held up a hand, silencing Beatrice and Felicity with a sharp, commanding gesture. He clearly expected this to be a call from his corporate legal team, a lifeline from his network of powerful associates, or perhaps a sudden reversal of fortune. He pressed the phone to his ear and barked his name. I stood completely still a few yards away, watching the exact moment his world ended. The voice on the other end of the line was not a high-powered defense attorney. It was not a political ally or a wealthy benefactor offering salvation. I could not hear the specific words spoken through the receiver, but the physical reaction was instantaneous and profound. Gregory's rigid, commanding posture simply dissolved. His shoulders slumped forward. The angry crimson flush drained completely from his face, replaced by a ghastly, translucent pallor. His jaw went slack. He stared blindly straight ahead, looking right through the bustling city traffic, his eyes wide and unblinking. Beatrice instantly recognized the shift. The frantic energy left her body. She grabbed his forearm, her voice dropping to a terrified whisper. She asked him who was calling. She asked him what was wrong. Gregory did not answer her. He could not speak. He was listening to the voice of an executive officer from their primary financial institution. Jamal had not just leveraged Felicity's surgical clinic. When the offshore venture capital fraud began to collapse under its own weight, and the clinic mortgage funds were entirely depleted by his mistress in Atlanta, Jamal had needed one final massive influx of capital to hold off his violent creditors. He had needed a hard asset with unquestionable staggering value. He had used the Thorne family estate. He had quietly, methodically cross-collateralized the sprawling multi-million-dollar Connecticut mansion. Using his proximity to the family finances and Gregory's misplaced trust, Jamal had forged the necessary authorization documents, securing a massive shadow loan against the ancestral home. The estate was the absolute core of the Thorne identity. It was the physical manifestation of their superiority, the venue for their high society galas, and the fortress from which they judged the rest of the world. It was their pride, their history, and their singular obsession. They cherished that property far more than they had ever cherished me. And Jamal had signed it away to predatory lenders. Because Jamal was entirely incapable of servicing the astronomical monthly payments on the shadow loan, the debt had gone into catastrophic default. The bank was not calling to negotiate. They were not calling to offer a restructuring plan or a temporary grace period. They were calling to inform Gregory that the grace period had expired months ago, completely hidden by Jamal's intercepted mail and forged banking statements. The executive on the phone was formally executing an immediate, unappealable foreclosure. Gregory's hand began to shake violently. The phone slipped from his numb fingers and clattered heavily onto the granite steps, the screen cracking against the stone. Beatrice dropped to her knees, scrambling to pick up the shattered device, but the call had already ended. She looked up at her husband, her flawless face twisted in a mask of absolute uncomprehending horror. Gregory finally found his voice, though it was nothing more than a hollow, ragged rasp. He looked at Beatrice, then at Felicity, and finally at Jamal. "We have exactly 72 hours," Gregory whispered, his voice stripped of all its former power and arrogance. Beatrice stared at him, refusing to understand the words. She demanded to know what he meant. She demanded to know who was on the phone. The bank, Gregory replied, his eyes entirely vacant. "They are seizing the estate. The locks are being changed on Friday morning. We have exactly 72 hours to vacate the property." The reality of complete, inescapable destitution slammed into the Thorne family with the force of a freight train. Beatrice let out a sound that was half gasp, half scream, collapsing against the stone balustrade. Her entire social standing, her wealth, her home, her legacy, all of it was gone, evaporated into thin air by the very man she had welcomed into her family with open arms. Felicity dropped to the concrete, wrapping her arms around her knees, sobbing uncontrollably as she realized she was not only losing her medical practice, but her childhood home. Jamal backed away slowly, his face a portrait of utter cowardice, realizing he had just rendered the most powerful people he knew completely homeless. I stood in the warm afternoon sunlight and observed the totality of their ruin. They had tried to destroy my future to preserve their own, and in doing so they had handed me the very tools of their own destruction. They were broken penniless and entirely without leverage. I turned away from the sobbing, shattered remnants of the Thorne family, walked down the granite steps, and stepped into the waiting car. The heavy door of my waiting town car closed with a muted, satisfying thud, sealing me inside the quiet, climate-controlled interior. As the driver smoothly pulled away from the courthouse curb, I did not glance back at the chaotic, screaming spectacle unfolding on the granite steps. My immediate objectives were complete. The aggressive asset freeze was officially dissolved. My corporate capital was entirely secure, and the launch sequence for the Cypher Core initial public offering was back on its precise, unyielding schedule. I calmly assumed the Thorne family would utilize their remaining 72 hours of shelter to retain aggressive bankruptcy counsel, or frantically pack whatever personal valuables the lending institution had not already claimed. I profoundly underestimated the terrifying bottomless depths of Beatrice's vanity. The delusion of grandeur. For a narcissist of my mother's caliber, the total evaporation of her generational wealth was merely a logistical inconvenience compared to the catastrophic, unimaginable horror of losing her social supremacy. She could endure an empty bank account, but she could not survive the pity of her peers. Faced with the brutal, undeniable reality of an impending eviction, Beatrice did not surrender. She entirely rejected reality. She engineered a strategy of breathtaking, almost admirable delusion. Beatrice possessed a single untouched platinum credit line. It was an emergency account registered solely in her maiden name, completely insulated from Gregory's scrutinized corporate assets and the federal freeze currently paralyzing Jamal's fraudulent offshore ledgers. It was her absolute last financial lifeline. A rational human being would have used those funds to secure a modest rental property or hire a seasoned defense attorney. Beatrice used it to book the grand ballroom at the Plaza Hotel. The Thorne Charity Gala was traditionally the crown jewel of the New York autumn social calendar, a lavish display of philanthropy, completely funded by the now decimated family trust. Operating under a manic, adrenaline-fueled panic, Beatrice forcibly moved the timeline up. She threw together a massive high society function in a matter of days, authorizing exorbitant, completely unpayable rush fees to secure premium catering, rare imported floral arrangements, and a renowned 20-piece string orchestra. She fully committed to the psychological theory that perception dictates reality. If she could successfully host the most opulent, visually staggering party of the season, the elite social circuit would entirely dismiss the whispered rumors of the Thorne family's financial implosion. The Trojan Horse. The philanthropic premise of the gala was a hollow, glittering facade. There was no actual charitable foundation, no silent auction to benefit a worthy cause. The Plaza Hotel ballroom was designed to be a hunting ground. Beatrice curated the guest list with predatory, exact precision. She bypassed the usual socialites and exclusively invited the most liquid, aggressively ambitious private equity investors, hedge fund managers, and venture capitalists in the tri-state area. Her objective was a high-stakes, multi-million-dollar confidence game. She intended to dress her entire family in bespoke designer couture, ply the guests with endless flutes of vintage champagne, and project an aura of such overwhelming, unassailable financial stability that the investors would be completely blinded to the truth. Under the sparkling crystal chandeliers, Jamal was instructed to deploy his final, most critical pitch. He was to present his empty, fraudulent offshore entity not as a collapsing Ponzi scheme, but as an exclusive, highly lucrative invite-only investment vehicle. He would use the sheer opulence of the gala as absolute proof of his success, tricking these financial titans into writing massive immediate checks to buy into his phantom fund. Gregory was tasked with playing the relaxed, unbothered patriarch. He was instructed to sip expensive Scotch mingle with industry leaders and casually wave off any rumors of a federal wire fraud indictment as the petty, jealous gossip of lesser competitors. Felicity was ordered to smile, display her diamonds, and project the image of a blissfully happy wife. The ultimate goal was to secure a massive influx of emergency capital before midnight. They planned to use the stolen investor funds to pay off Jamal's violent loan sharks satisfy the bank holding the foreclosure deed to the Connecticut estate, and magically erase the entire catastrophe. It was a desperate, spectacularly illegal illusion. The airtight quarantine. To ensure this fragile, highly volatile theatrical performance did not collapse, Beatrice had to neutralize her single greatest threat. I was explicitly, aggressively, and very publicly banned from the Plaza Hotel. Beatrice did not simply omit my name from the embossed gold-foiled invitations. She weaponized my exclusion. She proactively contacted key figures in her social and professional circles, carefully planting a fabricated, highly damaging narrative. She painted me as an unstable, deeply bitter outcast who was suffering a severe nervous breakdown due to the stress of my own failing tech company. She claimed I was wildly irrationally jealous of Jamal's phenomenal financial success and Felicity's perfect marriage. She went to extraordinary lengths to ensure her grift remained uncontaminated. Private detail. Beatrice hired an elite private security firm specifically to guard the ballroom doors. Visual identification. She circulated a high-resolution photograph of my face to the head of the security detail. Strict directives. She provided strict written instructions that if I attempted to step foot inside the hotel lobby, I was to be immediately intercepted, physically restrained if necessary, and forcibly escorted off the premises by uniformed guards. She needed an absolute airtight quarantine. She had to guarantee that I could not approach her wealthy targets. She had to ensure that I could not walk up to a hedge fund manager and whisper the documented truth about the impending federal charges, the clinic foreclosure, or Jamal's secret second family in Atlanta. Beatrice genuinely believed she had outmaneuvered me. She believed that by locking me out of the ballroom, she could successfully manipulate reality, secure the fraudulent capital, and buy her family's way out of absolute destitution. Inside the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, Beatrice's high-stakes illusion was operating at maximum capacity. The air was thick with the scent of imported white orchids and the crisp, expensive aroma of vintage champagne. Waiters in immaculate white coats circulated with silver trays of beluga caviar, moving seamlessly through a curated sea of the city's most formidable financial predators. A 20-piece string orchestra occupied a raised platform in the corner, filling the cavernous gilded space with a flawless rendition of Vivaldi. It was a masterpiece of manufactured opulence. Beatrice had effectively transformed her final line of credit into a dazzling, impenetrable smokescreen. Jamal was working the room with the frantic, sweat-soaked energy of a man fighting for his literal survival. He stood near a towering ice sculpture, completely surrounded by a tight circle of hedge fund managers and private equity titans. He wore a custom velvet tuxedo and gripped a crystal tumbler, enthusiastically pitching the absolute exclusivity of his offshore venture capital fund. He threw out buzzwords about disruptive technology, unparalleled return on investment, and closed-door opportunities reserved only for the elite. He was selling them the ghost of my grandfather's trust fund repackaged as the next great Silicon Valley gold rush. Across the room, Gregory anchored a table of aging real estate tycoons. He swirled a measure of incredibly rare scotch in his glass, laughing heartily at a joke he did not hear, projecting the relaxed, unbothered aura of a patriarch who practically owned the city. Felicity stood nearby, draped in borrowed diamonds, flashing a brilliant, practiced smile that completely masked the sheer paralyzing terror radiating from her eyes. They were entirely committed to the performance. They genuinely believed the quarantine was holding, the marks were taking the bait, and their salvation was only a few signed checks away. Then the music stopped. The conductor of the string orchestra abruptly lowered his baton, his eyes drawn to the back of the room. The sudden silence rippled through the grand ballroom like a physical shock wave. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Glasses were lowered. The collective gaze of 300 billionaires, investors, and socialites turned precisely in the same direction. The massive gilded double doors at the main entrance did not simply open. They were thrust apart with absolute, uncompromising force. I stepped across the threshold. I did not wear the conservative, unassuming business suits my family was accustomed to. I wore a custom floor-length couture gown of deep emerald silk. The fabric caught the light of the crystal chandeliers wrapping around me like liquid armor. The silhouette was striking, commanding, and entirely unapologetic. I moved into the ballroom with the slow, measured grace of an apex predator entering an enclosure. I was not alone. Beatrice's rented lobby guards were nowhere in sight. Instead, I was flanked by four massive, impeccably dressed men with discreet earpieces. This was not temporary event staff. This was an elite, highly specialized executive protection detail I had contracted directly from a premier global security firm. They moved in perfect synchronization with me, forming a silent, impenetrable human wall that parted the sea of confused, whispering guests. The murmurs began instantly. Beatrice had invited the most powerful financial minds in the tri-state area, assuming they would only recognize the Thorne family name. She completely failed to account for the fact that these men and women relentlessly consumed global financial news. They did not see a nervous, excluded daughter. They recognized the founder and chief executive officer of CipherCore. They recognized the woman who had just secured the most anticipated initial public offering of the fiscal year. Beatrice was standing near the grand staircase, gripping a flute of champagne. I watched the exact second her eyes found me. The smug, aristocratic satisfaction on her face shattered. Her carefully constructed mask of high society elegance violently collapsed, replaced by a sudden, terrifying shade of mottled purple. Absolute, unfiltered rage consumed her features. She realized her airtight quarantine had completely failed. Her hands shook so violently that the champagne spilled over the rim of her crystal glass, staining her designer evening gown. She did not attempt to maintain her decorum. She did not care about the hundreds of wealthy investors watching her. She dropped the glass onto a passing waiter's tray and stormed across the ballroom floor. Her heels clicked aggressively against the polished marble, her pace accelerating into a frantic, furious march. "Get her out!" Beatrice shrieked her voice, a shrill, piercing command that echoed brutally through the silent, cavernous space. "Get this woman out of my gala immediately!" She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face, signaling wildly to the remaining event staff hovering near the walls. Two of her rented security guards stepped forward, looking highly uncertain as they sized up the massive, uncompromising men flanking my sides. I did not stop walking. I continued my slow, deliberate progression into the absolute center of the room, stopping directly beneath the largest crystal chandelier. "You do not belong here," Beatrice screamed, closing the distance until she was standing mere feet away, blocked only by the broad chest of my lead security officer. "You are an uninvited, washed-up college dropout. You are a pathetic, bitter little failure, and I will not allow you to ruin your brother-in-law's legitimate success." The crowd of billionaires watched in stunned, captivated silence. They were witnessing the spectacular public meltdown of the Thorne family matriarch. Beatrice turned wildly to the surrounding guests, her eyes wide and manic. "She is having a severe mental breakdown," Beatrice announced, her voice cracking with desperate, hysterical volume. "She is bankrupt. Her little tech startup is completely insolvent, and she is obsessively jealous of my family. She is a fraud trying to extort us." She turned her purple, tear-streaked face back to me, entirely abandoning the last shreds of her dignity. She demanded that my security detail step aside. She ordered them to physically drag me out onto Fifth Avenue. She hurled every insult, every demeaning label, and every toxic narrative she had used to control me for my entire life, weaponizing her maternal authority in one final desperate bid to publicly humiliate me and protect her grift. I stood perfectly still, breathing in the scent of orchids and panic. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice, and I did not offer a single word of defense against her screaming, desperate tirade. I simply let her completely unhinge herself in front of the very people she needed to survive. Her shrill voice continued to bounce off the gilded molding, growing increasingly frantic as the silence of the room offered no validation. The titans of industry surrounding us did not murmur in agreement with my mother. They stared with clinical, detached disgust. In their world, wealth was measured in composure, and Beatrice was bleeding panic all over the imported marble. She took another aggressive breath, preparing to launch a fresh wave of fabricated accusations, but the words never materialized. A sudden forceful movement at the edge of the crowd shattered her momentum. Sterling Vance did not ask for permission to pass. The towering silver-haired real estate magnate was not merely a guest on Beatrice's desperate invite list. He owned the management syndicate that controlled the plaza's elite event spaces. He was the actual undisputed coordinator of the very ground we stood on. His heavy, tailored frame pushed violently through the tight circle of onlookers. His face was set in a rigid mask of absolute unadulterated fury. He marched directly toward the center of the confrontation. Beatrice turned her furious gaze toward him, her mouth open to demand his assistance in ejecting me. But Vance did not stop. He did not slow his pace. He used his massive shoulder to aggressively shove Beatrice aside. The physical impact was entirely unexpected. Beatrice stumbled backward, her designer heels skidding wildly across the polished floor. She collided hard with a high-top cocktail table, sending crystal flutes shattering onto the ground. She gasped her face, a portrait of utter, paralyzing shock, but Vance did not even glance in her direction. He stepped directly to the center of the room and raised a hand. He caught the eye of the audio technician stationed near the grand staircase. A sharp, piercing screech of audio feedback instantly silenced the string orchestra and snapped the attention of every single person in the massive ballroom. Vance was holding a wireless microphone. His grip on the heavy metal cylinder was white-knuckled. When he spoke, his deep, gravelly voice thundered through the towering speakers, completely engulfing the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Vance boomed, his tone devoid of any polite high society inflection. "I apologize for the interruption of your evening. However, as the managing underwriter for this venue, I have a strict obligation to maintain the integrity of the events hosted under my roof. It has become abundantly clear that a severe correction of the facts is required immediately." The 300 billionaires, venture capitalists, and hedge fund managers stood frozen. Nobody breathed. "You were invited tonight under the guise of the Thorn Charity Gala." Vance continued, his eyes tracking over the crowd until they locked onto Gregory. Gregory was shrinking into the shadows near the bar, his face the color of wet ash. Vance did not look away as he delivered the execution. "I am standing here to inform you that the Thorn family has absolutely no financial involvement in this event. Exactly 3 days ago, every single wire transfer, certified check, and line of credit provided by Gregory and Beatrice Thorn to this hotel, to the catering syndicate, and to the entertainment staff bounced completely hard. Insufficient funds, total catastrophic delinquency." A collective audible gasp rippled through the sea of designer evening wear. Beatrice pressed her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide and manic, shaking her head in silent, desperate denial. Jamal, who had been pitching his phantom offshore fund just moments before, suddenly found himself entirely alone. The circle of investors surrounding him had physically recoiled, stepping back several feet as if he carried a lethal pathogen. This gala was formally canceled on Tuesday afternoon. Vance announced, his voice echoing brutally off the vaulted ceilings. The vendors were packing up. The doors were being locked. The Thorn family was completely insolvent. The only reason the chandeliers are on, the only reason the champagne was poured, and the only reason you are standing in this ballroom right now is because a third party intervened at the 11th hour. Vance turned his gaze away from the wreckage of my parents and looked directly at me. The crowd followed his eyes, the sea of people parting even wider to grant me an unobstructed path. This evening was salvaged by a single exclusive diamond sponsor, Vance declared. She stepped in, assumed total liability for the Thorn family's fraudulent contracts, and paid the entire multi-million-dollar operating budget for this event in liquid cash. Allow me to introduce the actual host of tonight's gala, the founder and chief executive officer of Cipher Corp, Miss Cassidy Thorn. The room fell into a dead, absolute silence. The shift in the room's gravity was instantaneous and profound. The titans of industry, the very people Beatrice had hoped to swindle, were no longer looking at an unstable, excluded daughter. They were looking at an apex predator who had just publicly purchased her family's execution block. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I stepped forward. My security detail moved in perfect synchronized precision, clearing the final few feet between the center of the floor and the base of the grand staircase. The heavy emerald silk of my custom gown swept quietly across the marble. Every eye in the cavernous space tracked my movement. I could feel the intense burning stares of the financial elite recalculating my worth, my power, and my sheer terrifying capability. I walked past my mother. Beatrice was trembling so violently, she had to grip the edge of the cocktail table to remain standing. I walked past Jamal, who was staring at the floor, completely paralyzed by the realization that his final desperate grift had just been broadcast as a criminal sham. I reached the bottom of the grand staircase. I placed a hand on the ornate brass railing and ascended the velvet-lined steps with slow, measured, elegant grace. I did not rush. I allowed the silence to stretch, forcing my family to endure every agonizing second of their public unmasking. I reached the raised stage. Sterling Vance offered a curt, respectful nod and extended his hand. I stepped up onto the platform, turned to face the glittering, breathless crowd, and took the heavy microphone from his grip. The stage was finally mine. The cold metal of the microphone felt heavy and absolute in my palm. I looked down from the raised platform at the sea of upturned faces. 400 of the wealthiest, most ruthless financial minds in the Western Hemisphere were staring at me in total breathless silence. The sudden shift in power was so palpable, it felt like a drop in barometric pressure. I let the silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds, allowing my gaze to sweep over the crowd before finally resting on the Thorne family. Beatrice looked as though she might physically collapse. Her hands were clutching the edge of a cocktail table, her knuckles white, her face entirely drained of blood. Gregory stood rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly, a muscle ticked furiously in his cheek, paralyzed by his utter inability to control the narrative. Jamal was visibly sweating, shrinking back into the crowd, hoping the shadows would swallow him whole. Felicity was staring up at me with wide, terrified eyes, the borrowed diamonds around her neck catching the harsh light of the chandeliers. "Good evening," I said, my voice projecting crisp and clear through the towering line array speakers echoing off the gilded ceiling. "You were invited to the plaza tonight to participate in a grand philanthropic tradition. You were brought here to open your checkbooks, to network with your peers, and to listen to an exclusive pitch regarding a highly lucrative offshore venture capital fund." I paused, allowing my eyes to lock directly onto the cluster of hedge fund managers Jamal had been desperately trying to swindle just minutes prior. "I am pleased to inform you that your philanthropic spirit will not be wasted tonight." I continued, my tone entirely conversational, yet slicing through the room like a scalpel. "However, the multi-million-dollar capital investments you are preparing to make will be immediately redirected. Every single dollar raised this evening will bypass the Thorne family trusts entirely. Instead, all proceeds will go directly to the victims of Financial Fraud Foundation." A confused, unsettled murmur rippled through the crowd. Men in bespoke tuxedos exchanged puzzled glances. Women in couture gowns whispered behind their hands. The name of the charity sounded legitimate, but the context of Sterling Vance's preceding announcement hung heavy in the air. "I know many of you pride yourselves on your due diligence," I said, taking a slow step toward the edge of the stage. "You are private equity titans. You dissect portfolios for a living. But the predators operating in your own social circles rely on the illusion of generational wealth to bypass your usual scrutiny. Tonight, I am protecting your capital from a catastrophic insolvent scam. Let me show you exactly what you were about to invest in." Without breaking eye contact with the crowd, I raised my free hand and gave a sharp, definitive nod toward the elevated audiovisual booth at the back of the ballroom. The technician executed the command perfectly. The massive crystal chandeliers suspended above the dance floor instantly dimmed to a faint, ambient glow. The sudden darkness provoked a sharp intake of breath from the audience. A heavy, mechanized whirring sound filled the room as a colossal 40-foot projection screen descended from the ceiling directly behind me. A blinding pillar of white light shot from the back of the room, striking the screen with high-definition clarity. The first image to appear was not a charitable logo or a gala-sponsor tribute. It was a scanned, highly detailed copy of a commercial loan agreement. To a room full of financial experts, the document was instantly readable. I did not need to explain the mechanics of the fraud. The crowd of billionaires immediately recognized the predatory interest rates, the fabricated collateral, and the forged signature at the bottom of the page. It was the bridge loan Jamal had secured against Felicity's elite surgical clinic. The screen flashed transitioning with a sharp click. The next document was the official stamped notice of bankruptcy and default filed by underground creditors against that very same clinic. The staggering principal balance glowed in massive, unforgiving font. The crowd gasped in unison. This was not high society gossip. This was hard, undeniable, highly illegal financial data broadcast to the entire industry. I watched the faces of the investors contort in shock and disgust as they realized they had been sipping champagne with a man actively drowning in fraudulent debt. The screen flashed again. The corporate ledgers vanished, replaced by the deed to a sprawling, multi-million-dollar mansion located in an exclusive suburb of Atlanta, Georgia. The property was registered under an LLC, but the routing numbers linking the purchase directly to Jamal's phantom offshore accounts were highlighted in bright red ink. Then came the visual proof, the final annihilation of the Thorne family facade. Crystal clear, time-stamped photographs flooded the massive screen. The images were undeniable. They showed Jamal Thorne dressed in casual weekend clothes, unlocking the front door of the Atlanta mansion. He was not alone. The next photograph captured him wrapping his arms around a beautiful, smiling woman who was very clearly not Felicity. The final, most devastating image showed Jamal lifting a laughing 2-year-old toddler into the air on the front lawn of the secret estate. The ballroom erupted. The polite, constrained murmurs dissolved into a deafening roar of scandalized shouts and shocked exclamations. The facade was completely, irrevocably annihilated. The elite crowd recoiled, physically backing away from the Thorne family as if they were standing next to a live explosive. On the marble floor below, the illusion of the perfect marriage violently shattered. Felicity stood frozen, her eyes locked onto the towering 40-foot image of her husband holding his secret child. The blood completely drained from her perfectly contoured face. Her jaw trembled. The financial destruction of her clinic had broken her spirit, but the visual confirmation of a second family entirely severed her grip on sanity. She let out a sound that did not belong in the Plaza Hotel. It was a feral, guttural, completely unhinged scream of pure agony that cut directly through the noise of the crowd. Jamal spun toward his wife, his hands raised in a pathetic, trembling gesture of surrender. He tried to speak, his mouth moving frantically, but no sound came out over the roar of the ballroom. He took a hesitant step toward her, reaching out to grab her arm. Felicity did not retreat. She lunged forward with explosive, blinding speed. She brought her hand back and delivered a vicious, open-palmed slap directly across Jamal's face. The sharp, explosive crack of skin against skin echoed loudly across the room, momentarily silencing the nearest bystanders. The sheer force of the blow snapped Jamal's head to the side, sending his crystal tumbler crashing to the floor. He stumbled backward, clutching his rapidly bruising cheek, staring at his wife in sheer terror in front of 400 of the most powerful people in the city. Jamal stumbled backward, his hands still clamped over his rapidly swelling cheek. His eyes darted wildly around the ballroom. The predatory billionaires he had spent the last 2 hours trying to charm were now looking at him like a trapped rat. The realization of his absolute ruin finally short-circuited his brain. He did not attempt to apologize to his wife. He did not attempt to explain the photograph of his secret child. He turned his back on Felicity and bolted. He broke into a desperate, frantic sprint across the marble floor, pushing past a cluster of stunned real estate tycoons. He was aiming for the heavy brass push bar of the emergency fire exit located just past the towering ice sculpture. He lunged forward, throwing his entire body weight toward the door in a blind panic. He never made contact. The heavy doors swung inward with violent force, thrust open from the other side. Jamal slammed hard into the solid, unyielding chest of a man wearing a dark windbreaker with bold yellow lettering across the back. FBI. 3 more federal agents stepped into the ballroom, moving with swift tactical precision, completely blocking the exit. They did not look surprised. They had been waiting for my signal. Jamal Thorne, the lead agent, announced, his voice carrying a harsh, authoritative bark that cut through the lingering murmurs of the crowd. You are under arrest for severe wire fraud, interstate money laundering, and conspiracy to commit bank fraud. Jamal scrambled backward, slipping on the polished marble. He raised his hands in a frantic gesture of surrender, babbling incoherently about misunderstandings and accounting errors. The agents did not entertain his performance. 2 of them stepped forward, grabbed his custom-tailored sleeves, and slammed him against the wall. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoing through the silent room was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. He looked toward the stage, his eyes locking onto mine with a sudden horrifying understanding. I held his gaze completely unbothered. 3 days ago, my cybersecurity team at CipherCorp had compiled a meticulously encrypted dossier containing every forged signature, every routed offshore wire, and every illegal shell company Jamal had ever created. I had personally handed that flash drive to the Federal Bureau. The agents hauling him to his feet were acting on a warrant built entirely on my digital trail. The sight of federal agents placing a host in handcuffs was the ultimate unforgivable breach of high society etiquette. The 400 elite investors did not stay to watch the perp walk. Billionaires survive by instinctively distancing themselves from toxic assets, and the Thorne family had just become radioactive waste. The exodus was swift, brutal, and entirely silent. There were no polite goodbyes. There were no exchanged business cards or promises to follow up. The titans of industry simply turned their backs and marched toward the main gilded doors. They retrieved their cashmere coats from the coat check and vanished into the Manhattan night, fleeing the blast radius of my family's destruction. Within 5 minutes, the cavernous grand ballroom was completely drained of its manufactured life. The string orchestra had already packed their instruments and slipped out the service elevator. The catering staff evaporated. The room was hollowed out, leaving behind a sprawling landscape of collateral damage. Hundreds of half-empty crystal champagne flutes littered the cocktail tables. Abandoned plates of beluga caviar sat warming under the dim ambient light. A single overturned Chiavari chair lay near the grand staircase. The heavy, stifling scent of white orchids was completely overtaken by the sharp, metallic tang of fear. The heavy silence of the empty ballroom pressed down on the few remaining figures. My contracted executive protection detail maintained their perimeter, standing as silent sentinels guarding the edge of the stage. Sterling Vance had retreated to the lobby to oversee the federal agents escorting Jamal off the premises. That left only 3 people standing in the center of the ruined gala: Gregory, Felicity, and Beatrice. Gregory was leaning heavily against a marble pillar. His face was gray, his breathing shallow and rapid. He stared blankly at the shattered glass on the floor, stripped of his patriarchal authority, reduced to a bankrupt aging man who had just watched his legacy disintegrate into dust. Felicity sat collapsed on the bottom step of the grand staircase, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. The borrowed diamond necklace looked heavy and absurd against her trembling collarbone. She was rocking back and forth, staring vacantly at the exact spot where her husband had just been arrested, her life completely dismantled in a matter of seconds. Then there was Beatrice. There. My mother stood near the center of the room, looking around at the empty tables and the discarded luxury. The reality of her situation was finally breaking through her impenetrable wall of delusion. The quarantine was not just broken, it was vaporized. She had no money. The bank had seized her accounts. Her son-in-law was going to federal prison. Her home was in active foreclosure. Her pristine social standing was completely irreparably destroyed. She was a pariah. I stood on the raised platform watching her process the absolute finality of her ruin. Her knees buckled. It was not a calculated swoon or a theatrical faint. It was a complete, involuntary loss of motor function. She collapsed onto the hard marble floor. The heavy fabric of her designer evening gown pooled around her, absorbing the sticky residue of the champagne she had spilled earlier. She looked up at me. The arrogant, aristocratic fire that had burned in her eyes for 30 years was entirely extinguished. It was replaced by a raw, pathetic terror. "Cassidy," she whispered, her voice cracking into a wretched, broken sob. She did not stand up. She placed her hands on the floor and began to crawl. She dragged herself across the polished marble, her manicured fingers slipping on the wet stone. She crawled past the overturned chair and the discarded napkins, hauling her heavy gown behind her until she reached the base of the stage. She looked up at me, tears streaming down her purple mottled face, completely abandoning the last shred of her dignity. "Please!" Beatrice choked out, her chest heaving with desperate, ragged breaths. "Please, Cassidy, you have to help us. They are taking the house on Tuesday. We have nowhere to go. We have nothing." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the woman who had spent my entire life trying to erase me. "You have the penthouse," Beatrice pleaded, her voice rising to a shrill, hysterical pitch. "You have so much room. Please just let us stay with you, just until we figure this out. We are your family. You cannot put your own family on the street. Do this for the sake of family Cassidy. I am begging you." She reached a trembling, tear-streaked hand up toward the edge of the stage, her fingers grasping blindly at the air, waiting for a salvation I had absolutely no intention of providing. Beatrice's manicured fingers clawed frantically at the empty space above her. I stared down at the trembling, desperate woman who had spent my entire life orchestrating my destruction. I did not feel a sudden rush of pity. I did not feel the familiar suffocating guilt she had conditioned me to carry. I felt absolutely nothing. The emotional tether that had once bound me to the Thorne family was completely severed. I stepped down from the raised platform. The sharp, rhythmic click of my heels against the marble floor echoed through the cavernous, empty ballroom. My security detail parted seamlessly, allowing me to close the final distance. I stopped directly in front of Beatrice. She looked up, her makeup smeared across her cheeks in dark, jagged lines, her breath hitching with desperate, pathetic hope. She was waiting for a lifeline, entirely convinced that blood obligation would force my hand. I calmly unclasped my emerald designer clutch. The metallic snap sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. I reached inside and retrieved a sleek, leather-bound checkbook and a heavy gold fountain pen. I uncapped the pen with deliberate, unhurried precision. I used the smooth surface of a nearby cocktail table to steady the booklet. The only sound in the grand ballroom was the quiet scratching of the nib against the thick paper. Beatrice watched my hand with starving, wide eyes. She was mentally calculating the millions she believed I was about to surrender. She was already picturing the foreclosure being halted, the scandal being buried, the toxic illusion of her aristocratic life being funded for one more month. I finished the signature with a sharp, definitive flourish. I tore the check from the binding. The crisp tearing of the paper made Gregory flinch from his position against the marble pillar. I turned back to my mother and extended the slip of paper. Beatrice snatched it from my fingers with animalistic speed. She brought it close to her face, her eyes scanning the numerical line. I watched the exact second her feverish hope violently collided with reality. Her jaw went slack. The desperate, pleading expression on her face melted into absolute, paralyzing confusion. $200. She stared at the blue ink, entirely unable to process the number. She looked back up at me, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. "Here is your Uber money," I said, my voice echoing cold and hard off the gilded walls. "Get out of my venue and never come back. We are no longer family." I did not wait for a response. I turned my back on the wreckage of the Thorne dynasty and walked toward the exit, the heavy double doors held open by my security team, stepping out into the crisp, untainted Manhattan air. The collapse of their empire was not a slow, graceful decline. It was an absolute terminal freefall. The federal indictments moved with brutal, uncompromising speed, shredding the last remaining fabrics of their manufactured dignity. Jamal Thorne traded his custom velvet tuxedos and offshore accounts for a fluorescent-lit concrete box in a federal penitentiary. The man who had once charmed private equity titans now spent his days pacing the exactly 9 feet of his cell. There were no more champagne toasts or secret mansions in Atlanta. There was only the harsh, metallic slam of heavy steel doors and the crushing, inescapable reality of a 20-year sentence for severe wire fraud and money laundering. Felicity's descent was equally devastating. The financial shrapnel from Jamal's criminal enterprise completely obliterated her career. She sat in a sterile, windowless hearing room, facing the state medical board, entirely stripped of her borrowed diamonds and her arrogant posture. The board did not care about her high society pedigree. They cared about the massive fraudulent loans she had co-signed and the severe financial negligence that had bankrupted her clinic. They voted unanimously. Her medical license was permanently revoked, permanently exiling her from the elite circles she had sacrificed everything to inhabit. Gregory and Beatrice hit the absolute bottom. The bank seized the estate, the luxury vehicles, and the frozen trust accounts. They were unceremoniously evicted onto the street, forced to trade their sprawling manicured property for a cramped, moldy studio apartment in a decaying industrial suburb. Gregory, the man who had once terrified boardrooms with his patriarchal demands, was now wearing a stiff polyester uniform, spending his shifts mopping the linoleum floors of a discount grocery store. Beatrice, the former matriarch, who had weaponized her wealth to terrorize me, stood behind the counter of a greasy 24-hour diner. Her hands were no longer perfectly manicured. They were cracked and blistered from harsh cleaning chemicals. She spent her days wiping down sticky tables and enduring the sharp, unrelenting commands of a teenage shift manager, completely erased from the world of luxury she had worshipped. High above the city, completely removed from the suffocating toxicity of my past, the air was clean and absolute. My $50 million penthouse floated above Central Park, a sanctuary of glass and steel, bathed in the early morning light. I stood barefoot on the massive wraparound balcony, a hot mug of coffee in my hand. The wind whipped through my hair as I watched the Manhattan sunrise bleed across the skyline, turning the glass skyscrapers into pillars of fire. There was no fear left in my chest. There was no lingering shadow of the Thorne family's expectations. There was only the vast, untouchable horizon of my own making. I turned away from the skyline and walked back inside, my footsteps silent against the heated hardwood floors. I approached the massive marble kitchen island where my lead counsel had arranged the final heavily vetted legal packets. The thick stacks of paper represented the next evolution of CipherCore. I picked up my pen. I did not hesitate. I signed my name across the bottom of the charter, officially authorizing the launch of a massive, globally funded technology incubator. It was an institution designed explicitly to fund, train, and elevate brilliant young women who had been discarded, underestimated, and financially abused by their own support systems. I was weaponizing my vast resources to ensure that no other girl would ever have to endure the paralyzing isolation I had survived. I set the pen down. The ink dried instantly against the crisp white paper. The toxic chains of my past had not just been severed, they had been entirely obliterated. I had taken the brutal, crushing expectations of the Thorne family and forged them into an impenetrable armor of success. I had completely rewritten my destiny, claiming my space at the absolute pinnacle of the world, and I had done it entirely on my own. The story of Cassidy Thorne powerfully illustrates that our worth is never defined by the people who fail to see it, even if they are family. True power and security must be forged from within. When faced with a toxic environment that demands you shrink to fit a false narrative, the most courageous act is to walk away and build your own empire. Cassidy survived her family's betrayal by turning her trauma into fuel for phenomenal success, ultimately lifting other women up with her. Have you ever had to sever toxic ties to protect your future? Share your journey and comment below.